On the morning of June 3, 1937, 2 days before her wedding to the man who had given up the British throne for her, Wallis Simpson attempted to seduce someone else. The someone else was Herman Rogers, a wealthy American she had loved for 15 years, who was hosting the wedding at his villa in Touraine, and who was, inconveniently for everyone involved, happily married. The attempt failed. The wedding went ahead. The man Wallis actually wanted stood 20 feet away in the same house, while the man she was marrying stood at the altar 2 days later. Herman Rogers walked her down the aisle because no member of the royal family would come within a country of the ceremony, and his wife Lucy watched from the congregation, and when Lucy Rogers later looked Wallis in the eye and said, "You got your king, but I got your Herman," she was describing, in 7 words, the private architecture of the century's most famous love story. The palace knew none of this. The palace knew almost none of what was actually inside the marriage it had spent 3 years trying to prevent, and the prevention had failed, and the marriage had happened, and what happened inside it across 35 years was the story that the fairy tale required to not exist, and the story was considerably nastier than the fairy tale, and the nastiness ran in directions that the coverage has never fully assembled into a single account. Here is what the account assembles. In 1935, a year before the abdication, Special Branch was conducting a surveillance operation on the woman the Prince of Wales wanted to marry. The operation's files, kept under lock and key for 70 years and released in 2003, contain a report from a senior officer that describes what the surveillance had found. It found that Wallis Simpson, while conducting her relationship with Edward, was simultaneously conducting a secret affair with a married car salesman named Guy Trundle, described in the police file as a very charming adventurer, very good-looking, well-bred, and an excellent dancer. Secret meetings were made by appointment when intimate relations took place. The file also contains a sentence that the romantic account of the abdication has never adequately processed. Mrs. Simpson is apprehensive of losing the affection of the Prince of Wales, which she is anxious to avoid for financial reasons, not for love, for money. The police knew it in 1935. The public found out in 2003. The palace absorbed it in silence. In 1936, in the final days before the abdication, MI5 was bugging the king's own phones. The Home Secretary issued the order on the 5th of December 1936, marked most secret, intercepting calls between Buckingham Palace, Fort Belvedere, and the continent of Europe. The government of Britain was tapping the telephone of the sovereign of Britain because the trust between the monarch and his ministers had collapsed so completely that the ministers had decided there was no other way to know what he was about to do. The files sat in a cabinet office basement for nearly 80 years. When they surfaced, the palace said nothing. Anne Seber, the biographer who discovered 15 letters that Wallis had written to her estranged husband Ernest Simpson during the abdication crisis itself, found in those letters the private record of a woman who was, in the weeks the world understood as her triumph, terrified. "I am terrified of the court," she wrote. The letters describe someone who had wanted an adventure, a swan song before she turned 40, and had found herself trapped in a constitutional crisis she had not designed and could not exit. The man who had designed it, and who refused to exit it despite her repeated attempts to give him the option, was the man whose love for her the world had decided was the great romantic sacrifice of the century. His love for her, by the testimony of the historians who have examined it closest, was not romance. It was obsession, and the obsession was the specific kind that cannot be distinguished from control until the controlled person is inside it. And Wallis was inside it for 35 years. She called him lightning brain, behind his back, and sometimes to his face. She referred to his brother, the king who replaced him, as that stuttering idiot. She conducted the marriage in the register of a woman who has found herself married to a man she did not choose and cannot leave, which is not the register of the fairy tale. And he, for his part, conducted it in the register of a man whose love was so consuming that it produced in its object not gratitude but suffocation, and whose suffocation produced in Wallis the specific behavior of someone who needed periodic escape from the person who loved her too much, and whose escapes this account will describe in terms that the palace managed for decades and that the archives eventually disclosed. The palace's management of the marriage's private reality is the subject of this account. The management was thorough. The reality was worse than the management. What the reality contained, assembled from the declassified files and the discovered letters and the testimony of the people who were inside it, is what follows. If you're enjoying this story so far, don't forget to hit the like button and subscribe. Drop a comment telling me where in the world you're watching from. I love hearing from you. On a December evening in 1924, in the city then called Peking, a 28-year-old American woman walked into the Grand Hotel de Pékin, checked herself into a room, and began the specific project of rebuilding a life from the rubble of the first one. She had arrived in Asia 4 months earlier with the intention of saving a marriage, and the marriage had not been saved because the marriage had not been savable. Her husband, a United States Navy aviator named Earl Winfield Spencer, known to everyone as Win, had spent the preceding years making saving it impossible through the specific instruments that alcoholic men with violent tempers deploy against the women who stay with them. The beatings, the threats, the forced participation in humiliations that were designed to produce in the object of them the specific quality of broken compliance that passes, in the minds of people who deploy such instruments, for domestic peace. Wallis had complied for long enough to understand that compliance was not the solution, and had left. The specifics of what Win Spencer did in Canton, documented by Paul French in his 2024 account of Wallis's China year and corroborated in the biographies that examined her formation, are the specifics that the romantic account of the abdication has always preferred not to open. He beat and kicked her severely enough in Canton that she suffered internal bleeding. He dragged her to the establishments in Hong Kong that the men of his set frequented and made her watch, while he conducted himself in ways that the period's polite vocabulary described as consorting with women of easy virtue, and that the less polite vocabulary available to the people he was brutalizing described more accurately. When she told him she would seek a divorce, he threatened to kill her. The woman who would be described, in a few years, by the palace and the press and the public as the scheming American who ensnared a king, was in the autumn of 1924 a woman who had been physically beaten and sexually humiliated by the man she had married, and who was alone in a city she did not know, with very little money, and the specific courage of someone who has decided that the alternative to movement is death. She moved from Hong Kong to Shanghai, and from Shanghai to Peking, following the route that her social connections made available to her, and that her own social intelligence converted from a route of necessity into a route of reinvention. Shanghai in 1924 was the specific city that people in exactly Wallis's situation went to when they needed to become someone else, a city organized around the international settlement that the treaty ports had created, with its specific culture of expatriate glamour and its specific social world of Americans and British and Europeans who had come from elsewhere and who understood, from the inside, what elsewhere had produced in the people who had left it. She was received into that world with the combination of curiosity and warmth that a divorced American woman of evident intelligence and social skill received in a Shanghai that valued both, and she found there the beginning of the person she would spend the next decade becoming. Peking was where the foundation was laid, and Peking was where she ran into Herman Rogers. Catherine Moore Bigelow had become Wallis's friend years earlier, when both of their husbands were naval officers stationed in Coronado, California, in the specific way that naval officers' wives become friends, through the shared experience of waiting for men who are elsewhere and managing households organized around someone else's professional schedule. Catherine had since married Herman Livingston Rogers, the son of an American railroad millionaire, a Yale graduate of remarkable personal quality, who had retired at 32 to devote himself to travel and self-cultivation, and who was, by the accounts of everyone who knew him, one of those rare people whose good looks and intelligence and kindness all occupied the same person, without any of the three qualities competing with the others for prominence. He and Catherine had rented a courtyard house in Peking's Hutong district, and when Wallis arrived in the city, they offered her a room in it. She took the room. She paid rent, insisting on it, with the specific dignity of someone who understood that accepting charity, rather than hospitality, was a different kind of transaction, and who was not prepared to be a charity case. And she lived for months in the daily proximity of the man who was, by the subsequent testimony of the people who knew her best, across the following 30 years, the the person she loved most completely and most genuinely of anyone she ever met in her life. Andrew Morton, whose 2018 biography drew on materials from the Rogers family archive and on interviews with people who had known both Wallis and Herman, stated the conclusion his research had produced with the directness that the evidence warranted. Herman Rogers was the love of Wallis Simpson's life. The conclusion was not the conclusion of a biographer reaching for sensation. It was the conclusion of a careful researcher who had read the letters and interviewed the witnesses and assembled the pattern that the pattern produces when assembled by someone who is not invested in the romantic legend that the pattern contradicts. The letters Wallis wrote to Herman across the 3 decades of their friendship, the specific quality of her behavior at each crisis in her life when she turned to him rather than to her husband's, the documented fact that both of the marriages she contracted across those decades were contracted in his proximity and with his involvement, and the single sentence she delivered to the woman who married him after Catherine's death, "I'll hold you responsible if anything ever happens to Herman. He's the only man I've ever loved," constitute a body of evidence that the romantic account of the abdication requires to be suppressed entirely, and that the honest account requires to be examined first, because the examination reorganizes everything that follows. She met Ernest Aldrich Simpson in 1926, as she waited out the legal processes of her divorce from Win Spencer in London. Ernest was a Harvard-educated Anglo-American shipping broker, steady, cultured, genuinely kind, himself in the process of extracting himself from a first marriage to a woman named Dorothea DeCurt, whose bitter observation about Wallis, that she moved in and helped herself to my house and my clothes, and finally to everything, was the observation of someone who had watched the process from the closest available position and was not wrong about its trajectory. Ernest and Wallis married in 1928, and the marriage they made was, by the testimony of everyone who observed it, a genuinely functional and genuinely affectionate partnership between two people who suited each other in the specific way that people with comparable intelligence and comparable social sophistication and comparable taste in wine and conversation and the minor pleasures of a well-managed domestic life suit each other. It was not a grand passion, it was something more durable, and Wallis knew the difference. She was at the Rogers villa in the south of France, Louviers, in the summer of 1927, when Ernest Simpson's proposal arrived by telegram. She accepted it from there, which is the geographical detail that the romance of the Ernest marriage has never quite known what to do with. Because accepting a marriage proposal from the house of the man you love is the act of someone who understands that the man she loves is not available, and who is making the best available alternative arrangement with the specific pragmatism of someone who has been beaten and threatened and humiliated into understanding that the romantic ideal is a luxury that her circumstances do not permit. She was 31 years old. Win Spencer had given her the specific education that abusive first marriages give the women who survive them, which is the education of someone who understands what genuine danger feels like and who will not, in the available alternative, prioritize romance over safety again. Edward arrived in her life in the autumn of 1930, at a house party in Melton Mowbray, and everything the romantic version of their relationship has always claimed about that meeting, that she was the pursuer, that she set out from the beginning to capture the prince, that the abdication was the product of her design and his susceptibility, is contradicted by the contemporary record with a consistency that the record's examination has established across multiple biographies, without producing the revision of the romantic version that the examination should logically require. The contemporary record shows a woman who was not immediately captivated, who was amused rather than overwhelmed, who received the attentions of the heir to the British throne with the specific social competence of someone whose social life had produced more exciting evenings than a weekend's hunting in Leicestershire. She was, by her own account and by the accounts of the people who knew her in that period, not particularly impressed. What she was, and what the special branch files that were opened in 2003 confirm, in terms that the romantic account cannot dismiss, was increasingly aware of the financial dimension of the relationship's development. The 1935 Special Branch Report on Wallis, compiled at the direction of the Prime Minister Stanley Baldwin, contains the sentence that this account's opening section has already established. Mrs. Simpson is apprehensive of losing the affection of the Prince of Wales, which she is anxious to avoid for financial reasons. The sentence was written by a senior officer of the Special Branch, who had been maintaining surveillance on Wallis for months, and who was recording his assessment of her motivation with the specific neutrality of professional observation rather than the specific venom of the press coverage that would later construct her as a scheming predator. His assessment was that she was managing a financial dependency, not conducting a romantic campaign, and the assessment was the assessment of the person who had read her letters and traced her movements and interviewed her contacts and reached the conclusion that the evidence supported. The evidence also supported the existence of Guy Trundle, the married automobile salesman, whose relationship with Wallis was documented in the same special branch files in terms that describe a parallel affair conducted during the period of her deepening relationship with the prince. Trundle was described as very charming, very good-looking, well-bred, and an excellent dancer, and the file records that secret meetings were made by appointment when intimate relations took place. Wallis was simultaneously managing a relationship with the heir to the British throne and conducting a private affair with a married car salesman, and was lavishing gifts on the latter while positioning the former as the guarantor of her financial security. The Special Branch knew this in 1935. The palace managed the knowledge according to its institutional interests. The public did not learn of it until 2003, 67 years after the abdication whose romantic narrative the knowledge dissolves. She was not the predator the romantic legend required. She was a woman who had survived a violent marriage and had made the specific subsequent calculations that survival of a violent marriage teaches people to make, that financial security is not a luxury but a necessity, that emotional attachment to a person who is unavailable is a grief rather than a plan, and that the management of the available relationships in the directions that available relationships can be managed is the specific form of pragmatism that the alternative to pragmatism has taught you to value. The alternative to pragmatism was Win Spencer in Canton. Herman Rogers was in Peking, married to Catherine, not available in the way she needed him. Ernest Simpson was available, kind, suitable. Edward Windsor was the Prince of Wales, then the King, infinitely inconvenient, and becoming, by 1935, impossible to manage toward the exit that Wallis, in the months before the crisis, attempted to engineer repeatedly and unsuccessfully. The attempts are documented. The abdication crisis of 1936 is, in the private record that the palace managed and the public account suppressed, as much the story of a woman trying to escape a situation she had not designed, as it is the story of a king surrendering a throne for love, and the escape's failure and the surrender's completion produced the 35-year marriage that is this account's subject. The marriage began at the Rogers Villa in Touraine on the 3rd of June 1937, with Herman Rogers walking Wallis down the aisle toward the man she had not wanted to marry in the presence of the man she had actually wanted, and the palace, which had spent 2 years trying to prevent the wedding, knew almost nothing about the private architecture of what it had failed to prevent. What the palace knew, what it managed, and what the managed knowledge concealed about the marriage's private reality is assembled across the parts of this account that follow. In October 1936, Wallis Simpson packed a bag, left London, and drove to a rented house in the seaside town of Felixstowe in Suffolk, where she was required by law to establish 6 weeks of residence before the Ipswich Assizes could hear her divorce case from Ernest Simpson. She was 40 years old. She was the most discussed woman in England, her name not yet in the newspapers because the press had agreed to a voluntary suppression of the story that Stanley Baldwin's government had organized through the proprietors, but her situation known to everyone in the specific world she moved in, which was every world that mattered. She was also, in the letters she wrote from Felixstowe that autumn, demonstrably terrified. Anne Seber, the biographer who discovered a cache of 15 letters that Wallis wrote during the abdication crisis, described her reaction to the letters in terms that every person who has read them subsequently confirmed they were not the letters of a woman who was winning. They were the letters of someone describing, in real time, the specific experience of watching a situation she had tried repeatedly to control escape, the last of her control, and move toward a conclusion she had been trying to prevent. The first line that Seber recorded from the Felixstowe correspondence, "I am terrified of the court," was the line of someone who understood that the legal process she was now inside was the process that had to complete itself before anything else could happen, and that its completion was the last step in a sequence of events whose direction she had stopped being able to influence months before. The letters were written to Ernest. This is the piece of the Felixstowe correspondence that the romantic account of the abdication requires to be almost entirely ignored, because the romantic account is organized around the premise that by October 1936, Wallis had moved entirely into the emotional territory of her relationship with Edward, and that Ernest was the discarded former husband whose role in the story had concluded when Wallis fell in love with the king. The letters do not support this premise. They are the letters of someone writing to the person whose loss she was grieving, not reporting to a former partner whose relevance had ended. They carry the register, in the portions that Seba transcribed and published, of someone who had wanted a very different life from the one she was being given, and who was communicating that wanting to the person who would have been in it with her if the situation had not gotten out of hand. The situation getting out of hand was how Wallis later described it to people she trusted, and the description, offered in private rather than in the managed memoirs that Cleveland Amory was engaged to produce, and then abandoned after finding the material incompatible with the portrait his subject required, is the most honest available account of her relationship to the abdication's trajectory. She had wanted, in the words she used to Anne Seba's sources, an adventure before she turned 40, a swan song, the reassurance that she was still attractive to men, and the specific social elevation that the Prince of Wales's attentions provided to a twice-married American woman whose social position was real, but whose financial situation was the situation of someone living at the edge of what the available resources permitted. What she had not wanted, and what the letters to Ernest confirm she had not designed toward, was a constitutional crisis. She had not wanted to be the reason a king left his throne. She had wanted to be the reason a prince maintained a comfortable and manageable attachment that gave her the pleasures of his company and his resources without requiring her to be anything other than what she was. The specific evidence for this account of her intentions exists in the documented record of the abdication period, in a form that the romantic version has always been least equipped to handle, which is the record of what she actually did when it became clear that Edward was prepared to abdicate. She begged him not to. The begging is documented across multiple accounts and is not the document of a woman managing her way toward a crown. Wallis later wrote, "In the weeks before the abdication, I was willing to do anything, to prevent his going. I lied to our friends, I lied to the king, all in the hope that someone would put a stop to it." The lies she described were the lies of someone trying to create the exits that the king's determination to abdicate was closing. She offered to withdraw from the situation entirely. She offered to end the relationship. She told Edward that the relationship was not worth a throne, and Edward's response to each offer was the response of a man whose position on the matter was not negotiable, and who did not experience the offers as genuine because he had decided they were not genuine, and who may have been correct that they were partly performance, but who was certainly incorrect that they were entirely performance, because the Felixstowe letters to Ernest are not the letters of a performer maintaining a role. They are the letters of a frightened woman. Ernest's own role in the abdication crisis is the role that the romantic account has most consistently failed to examine honestly, because examining it honestly requires acknowledging that the marriage Wallis was in the process of ending was a marriage she valued in ways that the abdication narrative required her not to value. Ernest Simpson was not, in the autumn of 1936, the discarded placeholder of a woman who had always been moving toward Edward. He was the person Wallis had spent 8 years building a life with, a life of genuine shared pleasure in books and wine and conversation, and the specific domestic contentment that two people of comparable intelligence and comparable good taste can produce when they are not pretending to a passion that neither of them feels, but are instead occupying the more sustainable territory of genuine mutual affection and respect. The divorce was collusive in the specific technical legal sense of that word. Ernest had been discovered in a hotel bedroom with a woman. The discovery had been arranged rather than accidental, and both parties understood the arrangement and had agreed to it, because the alternative was the alternative that England's divorce law in 1936 did not make easily available. What the collusive mechanism concealed was Ernest's own devastation. People who knew him in the months following the divorce described a man who was processing a genuine loss rather than a convenient legal formality, and who maintained the dignified silence about it that would characterize his entire subsequent relationship to the events of 1936, in which he never gave an interview and never sold a word, and went to his death in 1958 as the only principal of the abdication who had not converted his proximity to history into a commercial product. The dignity was real, the loss behind the dignity was also real, and Wallis knew it and wrote to him from Felixstowe about it in terms that the portions of the letters that have been published indicate were the terms of someone acknowledging a cost that she had caused and that she was not pretending she had not caused. The divorce hearing took place at Ipswich Assizes on the 27th of October 1936. Wallis was granted a decree nisi, which would become absolute 6 months later, and the 6 months was the interval that the King's proctor could use to investigate whether the divorce was collusive and void it if it was. The investigation was a real threat. The government knew the divorce was collusive, and the King's proctor was an actual official with actual powers, and the possibility that the mechanism that was supposed to clear the path to the marriage would be used to close it instead was one of the specific terrors that the Felixstowe letters document Wallis processing in the weeks of her enforced seaside residence. The government was conducting its own surveillance of the situation from a position of knowledge that exceeded what either the King or Wallis understood it to have. The special branch operation that had been monitoring Wallis since 1934 had by the autumn of 1936 produced a file on her movements and communications whose contents, when they were eventually released in 2003, revealed that the government had been reading her letters, tracking her contacts, and assessing her character through the accounts of the people she interacted with. Throughout the period of the abdication crisis itself, the file documented the Guy Trundle affair, established in Part 1 of this account, and contained the assessments of Wallis's motivations that the Special Branch Officer's professional neutrality produced, assessments that described financial anxiety rather than romantic ambition as the primary driver of her management of the relationship with Edward. The file also documented, and this is the piece that the subsequent management of the crisis's narrative kept most carefully out of public circulation, a bomb threat. Someone sent Wallis a letter threatening to blow her up, and the special branch was sufficiently concerned by the threat to organize protection around the Felixstowe house. The woman being threatened was the woman the press and the palace and the government were simultaneously managing as a national menace and a personal problem, and the specific combination of institutional hostility and physical threat was the specific atmosphere in which she sat in her seaside rooms, writing letters to her estranged husband about being terrified of the court. Baldwin had organized the suppression of the story in the British press through a meeting with the newspaper proprietors that took place in October 1936, and at which he had, according to the accounts of people who were told of its substance, communicated the government's position on the matter with the specific authority of a prime minister who understood what the newspapers could and could not do in relation to a constitutional crisis whose public ventilation would produce instability that served no one's interest. The proprietors agreed. The American and foreign press were under no such agreement, and the story ran everywhere else, producing the specific situation of a country in which every educated person knew what was happening, and none of the newspapers were reporting it, which is a situation that produces, in the people living inside it, the specific quality of collective absurdity that precedes rupture. The rupture came when Edward went to Baldwin on the 16th of November and told him that he intended to marry Mrs. Simpson, and that if the government would not support the marriage, he was prepared to go. Baldwin had been expecting this conversation, and had prepared for it with the thoroughness that the most consequential prime ministerial interview of the century warranted. What Baldwin said, in the account that has been assembled from the records of the meeting and the subsequent descriptions of both men to people they trusted, was that the marriage was impossible on constitutional grounds, and that the Prime Minister and the Cabinet would resign rather than advise the King to proceed with it. The resignation threat was the specific instrument that converted Edward's determination from a personal preference into a constitutional crisis, because a Prime Minister and Cabinet who resigned over the King's marriage decision would force an election in which the constitutional question would be the campaign's central issue, and the campaign would expose the full circumstances of the marriage in a manner that the voluntary press suppression had been preventing. Edward received the information and did not change his position. He had been the most famous man in the world for 20 years, and the most famous men in the world for 20 years are not men whose positions on the things they care about are changed by the information that other people find the positions inconvenient. What they do with the inconvenient information is converted into evidence of other people's inadequacy. And Edward's conversion was the conversion of Baldwin's constitutional argument into evidence of the palace establishment's fundamental opposition to everything Edward valued, which was the interpretation of events that he maintained for the rest of his life, and that the memoir he subsequently published was organized around. Wallis, in her Felixstowe rooms, was not in Baldwin's meeting and was not informed of its full substance. She was receiving from Edward the information that the situation was developing in the direction she had been trying to prevent, and she was responding with the specific combination of fear and pragmatism that the Felixstowe letters document. She wrote to friends in America. She wrote to Herman Rogers, whose response, preserved in the auction records of the Rogers family papers, was a letter of unconditional support that offered his villa in France as a refuge if and when she needed to leave England. She wrote to Ernest, from whom she had been divorced for less than 2 weeks, in the register of someone who was describing a situation that had gotten entirely beyond her management, to the person who would have been her refuge if the situation had not gotten beyond her management. Archbishop Cosmo Lang of Canterbury had spent the preceding months watching the crisis develop from his own institutional position and doing what archbishops do with crises that are also constitutional questions, which is communicating the Church's position through the private channels that the archbishop's position makes available, without exposing the Church to the accusation that it is intervening in political matters that are not directly the Church's domain. The Church's position, communicated through those channels, was that a twice-divorced woman, whose former husbands were both still living, was not a person the Church of England could countenance as the consort of a sovereign who was, by the terms of the Constitution, the Church of England's supreme governor. The position was not negotiable. The Archbishop communicated it to the Prime Minister and to the Palace, and the communication contributed to the architecture of the impossibility that the King was choosing to walk into with the specific determination of someone who had decided that the impossibility was everyone else's problem. The abdication was signed on the 10th of December 1936. Edward signed 5 copies with a pen he kept afterward, in the council chamber at Fort Belvedere, in the presence of his 3 brothers, and the signing produced a legal document that transferred the British throne from one man to another and converted the first man from a sovereign into a private individual with a courtesy title. He broadcast to the nation that evening, and 30 million people heard him say that he could not carry the heavy burden of responsibility without the help and support of the woman he loved, and the broadcast was, in the specific dimension that this account has been assembling from part 1, not the whole truth. The whole truth was that Wallis had not wanted this. The whole truth was that Ernest had lost something he had not agreed to lose. The whole truth was that Herman Rogers had written from France and offered his house and his friendship to the woman he had sheltered through every preceding crisis of her adult life and who would arrive, within days, at his door. She arrived at the Villa Louviers in the south of France on the 12th of December, 2 days after the abdication, and she stayed there for 6 months while the world arranged itself around what had happened, and while the man who had caused it made his way, via a brief Austrian exile, toward the wedding at the Château de Cande that Herman Rogers would organize and attend, and at which Herman Rogers would walk her down the aisle, and the specific quality of what that walk required from both of them belongs in the part of this account that examines the wedding itself. What belongs here, at the end of the account of the trap closing, is the sentence that Wallis's own memoir could not contain, and that the Felixstowe letters could not conceal, the sentence that the whole romantic version of the abdication was constructed to prevent from being the organizing frame of the story. She had not wanted this. She had been terrified, financially dependent, politically surveilled, physically threatened, and married by a man whose love for her was of the kind that does not ask the loved person's permission before remaking their life around itself. The trap was not her design, it was Edward's devotion, and devotion that the devoted person imposes on its object without adequate regard for the object's own preferences is not love in any useful sense of the word. It is the specific form of possession that the palace, which had spent 2 years trying to prevent the marriage, never found a vocabulary for describing, and that this account is now required to describe, because the vocabulary exists and the evidence supports it, and the palace's failure to deploy the vocabulary was itself a management decision whose consequences are what the remaining parts of this account examine. George V died on the 20th of January 1936 at Sandringham, and among the last things he is documented as having said to his Prime Minister, in the weeks before his death when the succession was already a subject of private institutional concern, was the sentence that his Prime Minister subsequently shared with enough people that it entered the biographical record in multiple independent accounts. "After I am dead, the boy will ruin himself within 12 months. The boy was 41 years old. He was the Prince of Wales, the most celebrated royal figure of his generation, the man whose tours of the empire had produced the specific quality of popular attachment that no subsequent royal had replicated before or since. He was also, by his father's private assessment and by the assessment of every senior courtier who had served him across the preceding decade, a man whose relationship to the responsibilities of the position he was about to inherit was the relationship of someone who had spent 40 years performing the preparation for a role and had never, in all that time, actually prepared for it. The private assessments of Edward's fitness for the throne, assembled from the people who served him and observed him across his adult life, constitute a body of evidence that the romantic account of the abdication has always managed, by treating them as the prejudice of a stuffy establishment that could not accommodate a modern king. The management has been partially successful because the stuffy establishment framing is not entirely wrong, and because the affection that Edward generated in the public was real and large and organized around qualities that the establishment genuinely did find inconvenient: his informality, his accessibility, his willingness to say in public what people in his position normally said only in private. But the management has also concealed the specific dimension of the assessments that cannot be attributed to establishment prejudice, which is the dimension documented by the people who had observed him at actual work, in the actual performance of the actual functions of his actual position, and who found in that observation something that no amount of popular charm could resolve. Alan Lascelles had served as Edward's assistant private secretary from 1920, and his experience of the prince across those years produced the assessment he delivered to the Prime Minister Ramsay MacDonald in 1927, quoted by his biographer in terms that remain among the most searing private assessments of a royal heir in the modern record. He told MacDonald that he had sometimes thought, while abroad with the prince on tour, that it would be a disaster if the prince were to die, and that he had since changed his view and now thought the greatest possible blessing for the empire would be if he broke his neck. MacDonald, by Lascelles's account, said that he agreed. This exchange between the heir's own private secretary and the sitting Prime Minister of the United Kingdom, recorded in the private correspondence of both men, took place 9 years before the abdication, at a moment when Edward had not yet met Wallis Simpson, and its content is the specific evidence that the assessment of his unsuitability for the throne was not the product of his relationship with a twice-divorced American, but of his own conduct across a decade of observation by people whose professional function was to observe it. What the observation had found was documented across the biographies in terms that are consistent enough across independent sources to constitute a corroborated picture: a man who found the actual administrative work of his position actively unpleasant, and who expressed this finding through the specific mechanism of not doing it. The red boxes, the daily delivery of state papers that the sovereign is required to read and respond to, arrived at Fort Belvedere and were returned unread, or returned days late, with responses that bore the quality of someone who had skimmed the surface of their contents rather than engaged with them. This was documented by the civil servants who prepared the boxes and received them back, and it was documented by the palace officials who managed the relationship between the sovereign and the government, and it was documented in the private correspondence of the ministers who received the boxes' returns and noted their condition. The question of what Edward did with the state papers during the period of his relationship with Wallis is the question that the 1936 intelligence operation addressed most urgently, because the question was not merely one of administrative negligence, but of potential security breach. The government had become concerned that Wallis, who was being monitored by Special Branch throughout the period, was in contact with German diplomatic circles, and that the papers Edward was not reading at Fort Belvedere might be papers that Wallis was reading or transmitting in another direction. The concern was sufficiently serious that the Home Secretary Sir John Simon was prepared to authorize the interception of the King's own telephone calls to address it, and the authorization was given, and the interception was conducted, and the document recording both exists in the National Archives, where it was placed after its release from the Cabinet Office basement, where it had been stored for 77 years. The document is dated the 5th of December 1936, 5 days before the abdication, and it is marked most secret at its head. It records a Home Office instruction to the head of the General Post Office, Sir Thomas Gardiner, to arrange for the interception of telephone communications between Fort Belvedere and Buckingham Palace on the one hand, and the continent of Europe on the other. Wallis was on the continent of Europe, having left London for the south of France with her Aunt Bessie in late November, and the interception was specifically directed at the calls between Edward and Wallis during the final days of the crisis. What the interception found, if it found anything of substance, has not been made public in the form of transcripts. What it established, beyond any archival doubt, was that the government of Britain considered its sitting sovereign a sufficient security risk to warrant bugging his personal telephone calls to his prospective wife during the week he signed the instrument of his abdication. The palace has never publicly acknowledged the bugging. It has never addressed the question of what the intercepted calls contained. The document establishing that the calls were intercepted sat in a basement for 77 years, and when it was released, the palace's response was the response the palace applies to historical disclosures, that it cannot address without producing more coverage than the silence. Silence. The silence was the management of an institutional embarrassment that the passage of time had made no less embarrassing, and that no official statement could address, without raising the questions that any official statement would raise, which were the questions of what the government found in the calls, and what it did with what it found, and why none of it had produced any formal accountability for the man the calls concerned. The government had its own reasons for preferring the romantic account of the crisis to any account organized around the security questions, because the romantic account located the crisis in the private choice of a man in love, and the security account located it in the conduct of a monarch who had been sufficiently compromised in the judgment of his own ministers to justify bugging his telephone. The romantic account was the account that served every institutional interest. The palace's interest in presenting the abdication as a matter of personal, rather than political failure. The government's interest in not having it known that it had authorized the surveillance of its own sovereign, and the new King George VI's interest in assuming the throne in a context of sympathy rather than in the context of a security scandal involving his predecessor. The Archbishop of Canterbury's contribution to the institutional management of the crisis came in the broadcast he delivered on the 13th of December 1936, 3 days after the abdication, in which he addressed the nation on the subject of the former king, in terms that produced, in the immediate response of the people who heard them, a degree of public revulsion that the establishment had not anticipated, and that forced a subsequent moderation of the institutional tone around the abdication. Lang said, among other things, that Edward had sought a private happiness, and the phrase was understood by its audience as the condemnation it was intended as, a former king who had chosen personal desire over public duty, and the condemnation was received by the public as something unfair about a man they had loved, and the reception pushed back against the establishment's management of the abdication's meaning in the specific way that public sympathy for a handsome prince pushes back against clerical morality. What Lang knew, and what the broadcast did not say, was the dimension of his private assessment of Edward that the established record contains in his private correspondence and in the diary entries of people to whom he expressed it. He had known Edward for years in the specific way that archbishops of Canterbury know princes of Wales, through the formal occasions and the religious ceremonies and the private consultations that the relationship between the church and the crown generates, and what he had observed across those years, was a man whose religious faith was thin to the point of functional absence, and whose engagement with the constitutional role of the church in his sovereignty was the engagement of someone who regarded the church's requirements as inconveniences rather than obligations. The assessment was the archbishop's professional judgment, formed from professional observation, and its accuracy was not diminished by the fact that it was also the judgment of a man who found Edward personally uncongenial in the way that deeply conventional ecclesiastical personalities find deeply unconventional royal ones. Churchill's role in the abdication crisis is the role that the Romantic account of the crisis has always treated most generously, because Churchill's support for Edward during the crisis became, in the Churchill mythology that the Second World War subsequently constructed, evidence of the great man's instinct for justice and his resistance to the establishment's cruelty. The Churchill who wept in the Commons when he tried to speak in Edward's defence and was shouted down was the Churchill of the Romantic version, defending a man who was being persecuted for love against a system organised around the suppression of it. What the record also shows is that Churchill's support for Edward during the abdication crisis was the support of a man whose political judgment at that specific moment in 1936 was not the political judgment of the Second World War Churchill, but the political judgment of the 1936 Churchill, who was out of office, out of favour, and looking for a political vehicle that might restore his relevance, and who had identified in Edward's cause a possible vehicle without adequately weighing the question of whether the vehicle's driver was someone whose character warranted the support. The character question was the question that the abdication's management required to be treated as secondary to the constitutional question, and the management succeeded in treating it as secondary across the following decades, with the specific efficiency of an institutional narrative that has the resources of the palace and the government and the press establishment working in the same direction. The character question was, what kind of man was Edward VIII, apart from the man who loved Wallis Simpson? The answer that the private assessments assembled across the biographies provide, from Lascelles to the Foreign Office, to the ministers who dealt with the red boxes and the courtiers who observed him in private, was the answer of a man who was constitutionally unsuited to the role he had been born into, who had known it for decades, and had been known to know it, and who had found in the abdication not merely a personal tragedy, but a professional relief, an exit from the specific requirements of sovereignty that his formation and his character had never equipped him to meet. Wallis had understood the character assessment faster than most, because she was closer to the daily evidence of it than most, and her private vocabulary for Edward, documented in the accounts of people she confided in across the marriage, reflected the assessment of someone who had observed him at close range, without the public distance that protected the Romantic myth. Lightning Brain was the nickname she used for him, addressing him with withering sarcasm about never knowing what was going on, and the sarcasm was the sarcasm of someone who had been required to be the competent partner in a partnership between two unequal competences, and who expressed her awareness of the imbalance in the only private register available to her. The private register was the register of the house and the dinner table and the late evenings after the guests had gone, and it was the register that the palace never admitted knowing, and that the record has assembled piece by piece from the people who were close enough to hear it. The king nobody wanted was the king nobody had adequately prepared for not wanting, because the preparation for not wanting him required the acknowledgement that the preparation for having him had failed, and the acknowledgement would have required the institution to examine the specific ways in which its own formation of the man it had produced had contributed to the character that the formation could not accommodate in the role the formation was supposed to be building him for. The examination was not conducted in 1936. The crisis was managed instead through the specific instruments of the Romantic account, and the telephone interceptions, and the Archbishop's broadcast, and Churchill's performance in the Commons, and the management produced the version of events that the public received, and that this account has been examining from the angle that the management required to be suppressed. The suppression's success was total in the short term and partial in the long term, because the short term produced the Romantic account and the long term produced the biographies, and the biographies had access to the private assessments that the management had not burned. Lascelles's diaries were published. The special branch files were released. The Cabinet Office basement yielded its most secret document, and the palace continued, across all of it, to manage the narrative of the abdication as the story of a man who loved a woman and chose her over a throne, because the alternative was the story of a man who was unfit for the throne and used the woman as the instrument of an exit he had been constructing for years, and the alternative was the story that the institution was constitutionally least equipped to tell about itself. The Château de Caen stood in the Loire Valley, near the town of Mons, in the Indre-Loire department of France, a 16th-century pile of turrets and terraces that its American owner had converted, across the preceding decade, into the kind of house that serious money applied to historical architecture produces, when the money has no particular attachment to the history, but a very particular attachment to the comfort. The owner was Charles Bedeau, and the specific nature of his wealth and his attachments is the dimension of the wedding's venue that the romantic account of the ceremony has always preferred to present in the minimal terms of a French chateau lent by a generous friend, because the fuller terms of who Bedeau was and what he represented required a context that the romantic occasion could not accommodate without becoming something else. Charles Bedeau had built his fortune through the management consultancy he operated across Europe and America, selling to industry the efficiency systems that bore his name, the Bedeau units of measurement that quantified worker output and allowed employers to extract from their labor forces the maximum measurable productivity at the minimum manageable cost. The systems were hated by organized labor on both sides of the Atlantic, with the specific hatred that workers direct at the instruments of their own maximum extraction, and the hatred would become relevant to the Windsor Stories American chapter in ways this account will address in the part examining the Bedeau organized American tour that never happened. What matters here is the European dimension of Bedeau's business, and the specific clients that the European dimension had made his largest and most profitable. His largest and most profitable clients in 1937 were the industrial enterprises of the Third Reich, and his relationship with the Reich's economic machinery was the relationship of a man who had identified in National Socialism the most thoroughgoing implementation of the efficiency principles he had been selling to democracies for 20 years. He had met Goering and had dined with the Nazi leadership and had established his consultancy inside the German industrial system at a moment when the German industrial system was converting itself to the specific purpose of arming a war. This was the man who lent his house for the most famous royal wedding of the century. The British government knew his associations. The palace knew his associations. Herman Rogers, who organized the wedding's practical arrangements from his own villa 100 miles south, and who was the person most directly in contact with Bedeau throughout the planning, presumably knew his associations in the general terms that people who moved in the international social world of the 1930s, wealthy, knew such things. None of the knowledge prevented the use of the house. The use of the house required overlooking the knowledge, and the overlooking was accomplished with the specific ease that significant inconvenient knowledge receives when the people required to act on it have other priorities, and the inconvenient knowledge is about someone else's associations rather than their own. George VI had been king for 6 months when his brother's wedding date was confirmed, and his private instructions about the attendance of royal family members at the ceremony had been given in the private form that such instructions take when they are instructions rather than prohibitions, suggestions rather than orders, communications that achieve the effect of commands while preserving the fiction that the recipient has exercised their own judgment in reaching the commanded conclusion. The fiction was necessary because the alternative was the spectacle of the king formally forbidding his relatives to attend his brother's wedding, which was a spectacle the institution could not produce, without admitting that the institution was actively hostile to the marriage it could not legally prevent. So the communications were made in the private form, and the relatives received them and reached their own conclusions, and the conclusions were unanimous, and the chateau on the wedding day of the 3rd of June 1937 contained none of the people who might have been expected to be there. Queen Mary's letter to her son, written in the period before the wedding and preserved in the royal archives, was the most complete expression of the family's position in the form that the family's most senior female member applied to situations that required the expression of a position without the creation of a public record that could be cited as evidence of the family's management of the exile. She wrote that she could not find it in her heart to send Wallis her love, and that she hoped Edward would understand. The hope was the specific hope of a woman who had spent 60 years inside an institution organized around the management of emotional content for public consumption, and who had developed, from that formation, the specific skill of saying the most devastating possible thing in the most restrained possible form. She could not find it in her heart was not a statement of emotional incapacity. It was a statement of settled policy. Walter Monckton, the lawyer who had been Edward's closest confidant through the abdication crisis, and who remained in contact with him across the following years as the liaison between the Duke and the palace that neither side could manage without, attended the wedding as the sole representative of the English establishment that had produced the groom. His presence was the presence of a man who liked Edward personally and understood the institutional requirements that the personal liking had to accommodate, and his subsequent account of the wedding, given to his biographer and quoted in the literature, described the occasion with the specific quality of someone who was measuring the distance between what a wedding of this kind should have been and what it actually was. What it actually was, in the practical and human terms that the photographs and the accounts of the people present assembled, was a ceremony of approximately 20 guests in the chateau's great hall, with the local mayor of Mons officiating the civil ceremony and a Church of England clergyman named Robert Anderson Jardine, who had volunteered his services against the explicit instructions of his bishop and would be disciplined for it afterward, conducting the religious rite. The Bishop of Durham had formally refused to send a clergyman, and the bishop's refusal was the institutional position of the Church of England, translated into the practical terms of a wedding without a willing priest, and the solution of an irregular clergyman who would suffer professional consequences for his willingness was the solution of an occasion that had run out of institutional support and was proceeding on the resources of the people who had decided to show up regardless. Cecil Beaton was there with his camera. The photographs he made that day are the photographs that the Century has kept of the occasion. The images of Wallis in her Mainbocher dress of Wallis blue and Edward in his morning coat on the stone terrace of the chateau. And the photographs are the photographs of a woman performing composure so precisely that the performance is only visible as a performance when it is placed beside the account of what the woman was doing the morning before the photographs were taken. The morning before the photographs were taken, according to Andrew Morton's account in Wallis in Love, Wallis Simpson attempted to seduce Herman Rogers. Herman was in the chateau in his capacity as the wedding's practical organizer and Wallis's most trusted friend, and the attempt was made in the specific context of the last available opportunity, the last morning of her life as someone who was not yet married to Edward, in which the choice she had been trying to unmake for the preceding year could theoretically still be unmade. The attempt failed. Herman refused. He was, by the account of everyone who knew him, a man of considerable personal integrity, and the integrity held against what the attempt represented, which was the specific desperation of someone who had been told by a situation that the situation had closed, and who was conducting a last search for the door that the situation had been promising did not exist. Lucy Wan was not yet in the picture. Catherine Rogers was alive and present, the wife of the man Wallis was attempting to reach in the final hours before her wedding, to the man she had not chosen, and Catherine's presence in the house is the specific element of the morning's episode that the Morton account does not address directly, because the account is reconstructed from testimony rather than from contemporary documentation, and the testimony has its limits. What the account establishes is the attempt and its failure, and what the failure produced, in the hours that followed, was the performance in Wallis blue on the chateau's terrace, composed and precise and impeccable, that Beaton's lens captured and the Century kept. Herman Rogers walked her down the makeshift aisle in the great hall because there was no one else available to do it, and because the logic of the whole preceding 15 years of their friendship required that if anyone was going to walk her toward the life she had been trying to avoid, it should be the person whose unavailability was the reason she was walking toward it. The specific quality of the walk, described by people who were present in terms that placed it in the category of moments that the participants registered as significant, without being able to say exactly why, was the quality of a public act that was carrying something private within it, visible to the people who knew what it was carrying, and invisible to the people who did not. The ceremony was over within the hour. The mayor's portion took less than 10 minutes. Jardine's portion took slightly longer. The 20 guests witnessed the exchange of vows in a room that contained, by the accounting of the absent, the entire institutional world of the groom's formation, conspicuously not assembled. And the exchange was the exchange of two people becoming legally something they had been publicly described as inevitably becoming for a year, and the becoming was completed, and the photographs were taken, and the guests were received, and the champagne was served, and then it was done. The letters patent that denied Wallis the style of Royal Highness had been issued by George VI on the 27th of May, 1 week before the wedding, and their timing was the timing of an institution that had waited until the last possible moment to deliver the maximum possible legal precision to the position it was taking, which was the position that whatever Wallis was becoming by marrying Edward, she was not becoming a Royal Highness. The legal mechanism of the denial was the mechanism of the royal prerogative over titles, exercised by the king on the advice of the government's law officers, and the law officers had confirmed that the king had the power to restrict the style's application to Edward personally and to exclude from it the person Edward was marrying. The restriction was implemented, the style was denied, the Duke received it as the wedding present he described it as, and never stopped describing it as, for the rest of his life. Beaton's private diary entries from the wedding day are the document that sits beside his photographs, with the specific quality of the document that tells what the photographs do not. He noted, among other observations, the Duke's visible emotion during the ceremony, and the Duchess's visible composure, and the specific gap between the two that the occasion produced in a man who had given up a throne for a woman who was performing her receipt of the gift with the trained professionalism of someone who understood that the performance was now the permanent condition. He also noted the absence, the quality of the room, in terms of who was not in it, and the absence was the document that the institution had communicated through the people it had persuaded to stay away, the statement that could not be made publicly and was made privately through the mechanism of the empty chairs. The honeymoon took the couple to Austria, then back to France, where they spent the first winter of the marriage at the Rogers Villa, Louviers, in the company of the man Wallis had tried to reach the morning before the wedding, and who remained, across the months of that first winter, the most constant presence in her daily life outside the marriage itself. Edward golfed and gardened. Wallis organized the household with the precision she applied to every domestic situation she occupied. Herman was there, a few miles away, or in the house itself, the friend and confidant whose friendship had survived the attempt, and whose presence in the marriage's first months was the presence of someone who had decided that the friendship was more important than the morning's episode, and who was proving the decision through the consistency of his attendance. Lucy Wan was a dozen years away. Catherine was alive and married to Herman. The marriage that would eventually produce the "you got your king, but I got your Herman" exchange existed in 1937 only as the potential that Wallis's behavior on the wedding morning had expressed, and its expression had been refused, and the refusal was the last clear decision of the period, before the marriage's daily reality replaced the preceding year's crisis as the context in which both the Duke and Duchess were now required to live. What the daily reality of the marriage looked like, assembled from the accounts of the people who were inside its first years, and what it did to both of the people inside it, is the next part of this account. The marriage the palace never admitted was as complicated as the wedding the palace never attended, and the complication began within months of the ceremony, and continued across 3.5 decades, and the documentation of it is what this account was built to examine. Thelma Furness was having lunch at the Ritz in London in January 1931, when the woman who would replace her walked through the door. She had brought Wallis Simpson to the lunch herself, in the specific act of social generosity that women who are confident in their positions perform when they introduce their friends to the people they are attached to and do not yet understand that the introduction is also an audition. Thelma was the Prince of Wales's companion of 3 years' standing, the American-born twin sister of Gloria Vanderbilt's mother, a woman of considerable social glamour and genuine personal warmth, who had established herself in the prince's life as the person he preferred to be with, which was, in the vocabulary of the institution's management of the heir's romantic life, the position that carried no formal title and no institutional acknowledgement and no protection whatsoever against the day the prince preferred someone else. That day arrived in February 1934, when Thelma left for America on personal business and made the single social error whose consequence she spent the rest of her life understanding. Before she sailed, she asked Wallis to look after the little man. The little man was her term for the Prince of Wales, the heir to the British throne, the most famous person in the world, and her use of it tells something about the specific register in which the relationship operated in private, which was not the register of a great royal romance, but the register of two people who had developed, across 3 years of intimacy, the private vocabulary of people who are close enough to each other to be unimpressed. Wallis promised to look after him. She kept the promise more thoroughly than Thelma had anticipated. When Thelma returned from America, she found what the women who have told this story in the subsequent accounts have described, with varying degrees of diplomatic skill and varying degrees of directness, as a changed atmosphere. The prince was at Fort Belvedere when she arrived, and the changed atmosphere manifested at dinner in the form of a small piece of bread that the prince picked up from beside Wallis's plate and crumbled in his fingers, and Wallis tapped his hand in the gesture of someone who has the right to correct another person's table manners, and Thelma looked across the table and understood what the tap meant and what its meaning cost her. She said nothing at dinner. She left Fort Belvedere the following morning. She never returned. The bread incident has been repeated in every account of the transfer from Thelma to Wallis, because it is the account that both women subsequently told, independently, in terms that agreed on the essential detail of the tap, and because the tap is the image that most efficiently captures what the transfer of the prince's primary attachment actually looked like in practice, which was the replacement of one woman's permission to correct him with another's, and the replacement was accomplished not through any declaration or confrontation, but through the simple visibility of the thing, observed across a dinner table by the person it was replacing. Thelma later wrote that she caught Wallis's eye across the table and that the look she received back told her everything she needed to know. The look, whatever it communicated, was sufficient. She left the next morning. What replaced Thelma in the prince's life was not the relationship that the replacement produced in him, but the relationship it produced in her, and the two relationships were substantially different from each other in ways that the romantic account of the abdication has always been required to elide. His was the obsession that Tracy Borman's research, conducted for the Smithsonian documentary on the Windsors, described as clingy and cloying, and that the historian organized around the specific evidence of a man who wanted Wallis entirely to himself, who could not tolerate her absence, without the specific anxiety that people who have organized their emotional existence around another person feel when the other person is not immediately available. Hers was the management of a situation she had not designed and was increasingly uncertain how to exit. The Fort Belvedere household in the years between 1934 and the abdication was the household of the heir to the throne during his working week, and the people who worked in it observed the relationship between Edward and Wallis from the specific proximity of domestic service, which is the proximity of people who are present in the rooms where things actually happen, and who are required by their professional function to be invisible while being present, and who remember, across the decades, what being invisible in those rooms actually involved. The accounts collected by biographers who interviewed the household staff of that period describe, with the consistency that corroborated observation produces, a man whose behavior around Wallis had the specific quality of someone who was not operating from a position of strength. He deferred to her in matters of taste and opinion and social management, with the comprehensive deference of someone who had identified in another person the qualities he lacked and had organized his dependence on those qualities in the form of an attachment that the other person had not sought and was finding increasingly difficult to manage. The phone calls were the most documented expression of the obsession's daily operation, and they were documented because the people who fielded them on Wallis's behalf in the houses where she stayed and the social occasions she attended found them sufficiently remarkable in their frequency and their urgency to record. He called multiple times a day when they were apart, and the calls were the calls of a man checking that she was still there, rather than the calls of a man with specific things to communicate, And the distinction between the two kinds of calls is the distinction between the ordinary desire for contact that intimate relationships produce and the specific anxiety of someone for whom the other person's continued presence is not the comfortable assumption of a relationship, but the necessary condition of psychological function. The people who answered the calls on Wallis's behalf in the houses where she was staying noted that the frequency increased when she was in company he had not arranged, and decreased when he knew precisely where she was and what she was doing, which is the specific pattern of the jealous attachment rather than the loving one. Edward's letters to Wallis, in the portions that have been published and examined, carry the specific register that his letters to Frieda Dudley Ward had carried in the decades before, and the continuity of the register across the two relationships is the evidence that the register was his rather than the relationship's, which is to say that what the letters reveal is not the specific quality of his feeling for Wallis, but the specific quality of his attachment style, which was an attachment style that remained constant across the succession of women who occupied the primary position in his emotional life. The Frieda letters, published after her death, had shocked the people who read them, not with their passion, but with their infantilism, the nursery diction, the self-diminishment, the specific register of a small boy writing to his governess rather than a grown man writing to his lover, the references to himself in the diminishing third person, the threats of despair over separations of days that a person of ordinary emotional resilience would not have found devastating. The Wallis letters carried the same register, because the register was his, and the revelation of the register's consistency across two relationships, separated by a decade, is the revelation that the attachment was not the product of the specific person being attached to, but of the specific person doing the attaching, and the specific person doing the attaching had been doing it since young manhood, without either the person being attached to or the institution managing the attacher finding an adequate way to address what the attaching expressed. What it expressed, and what the biographers who have examined Edward's formation most carefully have reached toward as the organizing explanation of the adult pattern, is the formation described more fully in Part 13 of this account, and touched on here in the dimension relevant to the obsession's daily operation. A man raised inside a family that did not demonstrate affection, and an institution that required its performance, had never received the specific experience of being loved without condition, and had never developed the specific confidence of someone who has received it. The confidence of unconditioned love is the confidence that another person's presence does not require constant verification, that the relationship's continuation is not dependent on the loved person's moment-by-moment confirmation of their continued willingness to be in it, that an afternoon apart is an afternoon rather than a threat. Edward had not developed this confidence, and the absence of it produced in him the attachment behavior that Thelma had managed and that Wallis was now managing and finding, in the testimony she provided to people she trusted, considerably harder to manage than Thelma's 3 years had required. She found him, as this account has established through her own documented vocabulary, too much. The phrase carries, in the specific register of someone who is choosing their words carefully, the specific weight of a person describing an experience that the more accurate vocabulary would describe more harshly. Too much means present beyond the desired degree, attentive beyond the welcome limit, demanding beyond the sustainable level, and in the context of a relationship in which the too much person was also the heir to the British throne and subsequently the King of England, too much carried institutional weight alongside the personal weight, because the institutional weight meant that the person experiencing the too much had no available social mechanism for addressing it. You cannot tell the King of England that he is too much. You cannot tell the Duke of Windsor that his love for you is organized around his needs rather than yours. You can tell Herman Rogers, in the south of France, on the morning of your wedding, when the last available door is still theoretically available. Wallis's private communications to people she trusted across the marriage years, assembled from the accounts that the biographies drew on, describe a woman who had found a management system for the obsession rather than a resolution of it. The management system was the Donahue years, which this account does not re-examine here since they were covered in the previous Windsor account, and it was the Herman correspondence, and it was the specific social architecture of the Paris years, in which Wallis organized the household and the dinner parties and the guest lists, and the Duke organized himself around the schedule she produced, and the organizing gave her the function that the obsession would otherwise have consumed entirely, because a woman who is managing a court has a reason to be outside the orbit of the man who wants her entirely inside it, and the reason was the one she made for herself. The making of the reason was the most creative act of Wallis Simpson's later life, and it was not credited as a creative act in the romantic account of the marriage, which preferred to see the managing of the household as the extension of the managing of the man. The two activities collapsed into the single activity of being Wallis, the woman the king had given up his throne for. What the creative act actually was, assembled from the accounts of people who watched her produce it across the decades, was the construction of a sufficient number of activities whose existence justified the specific amount of autonomy from Edward's presence that the activities required, and the justification of the autonomy was the justification of the space in which she could be herself rather than the object of his obsession, and the space, however narrow and however constantly under the pressure of the obsession's demands, was the space in which the private person that the public performance of the marriage concealed could exist. The public performance was the performance of reciprocal devotion, and it was maintained across 35 years of social occasions and press photographs and official appearances with the sustained professional competence of two people who had agreed, in whatever private negotiation the marriage had produced, that the performance was the version of their relationship that the world was entitled to and that both of them were required to maintain. The agreement was not explicitly described in any document this account has access to. It is reconstructed from its product, the performance, and from the private testimony that existed alongside the performance in the register of the people who were close enough to both parties to see what the performance was managing. The managing was, in the end, the marriage, and the marriage was, in the end, the two of them inside the performing of it, and the space between what the performing required and what the private record documents was the space this account has been measuring from its first sentence, and that the palace never admitted existed, because the palace's management of the abdication's legacy required the space to not exist and required the performance to be the reality, and the performance was maintained long enough and thoroughly enough that the palace's requirement was substantially met, and the space remained a space rather than a publicly acknowledged gap, and the gap that the private record contains is the gap that this account is assembling from the testimony that the performance could not entirely suppress. The testimony's most specific dimension, the accounts of what the obsession produced in the people who were required to manage it from inside the marriage's domestic architecture, is the next part of this account's subject. What Wallis told people she trusted, what the household witnessed, what the letters that survived contain, and what the marriage looked like from the inside of the institution that produced the performance and managed the gap between the performance and the reality for 35 years without ever publicly acknowledging that the gap existed at all. Herman Rogers died of throat cancer in May 1949, and Wallis Simpson was on the other side of Europe when it happened, managing the specific social calendar of the exile years, and when the news reached her she is documented, in the accounts of the people around her in that period, as having received it with a response that the people around her found disproportionate to the loss of a friend, however close a friend. The disproportionality is the evidence. Herman Rogers was Wallis's friend, genuinely and durably, across 25 years of a friendship that had provided Wallis with shelter, support, and the consistent presence of the person she trusted most in the world, alongside the husband of that person. The grief Wallis displayed when Catherine died was not disproportionate to the loss of Catherine. It was proportionate to what Catherine's death made suddenly possible and immediately threatened, which was the access to Herman that marriage to Catherine had prevented, and that the specific social world of grief and widowhood now, briefly and preciously, opened. Herman Rogers was 58 years old when Catherine died. He was, by the accounts of everyone who knew him, unchanged by the years, in the ways that men of genuine personal quality are unchanged. The brown wavy hair that Andrew Morton's sources described from the Peking period was grey now, but the bearing that had attracted Wallis's attachment across a quarter century was the bearing of someone whose self-possession had never required youth to sustain it. He had spent 25 years as Wallis's most constant friend, the person she fled to in every crisis, the presence she organized the largest decisions of her life around. And now he was free, and the freedom arrived at the precise moment in Wallis's life when the marriage she was inside had produced enough of its specific daily texture for her to understand, in the clearest possible terms, what the alternative would have felt like. Lucy I understood this before most of the people around either of them understood it, because Lucy I was a socially ambitious American widow who had been moving in the Rogers-Windsor social circle for long enough to have made her own assessment of the relationships she was observing, and her assessment was the assessment of someone who intended to act on it. She knew Wallis wanted Herman. She knew Wallis would move if the opportunity existed, and she had decided the opportunity would not exist for long if she managed her own timing correctly. She began maneuvering for Herman's attention within months of Catherine's death, with the specific urgency of someone who understood that the window in which the maneuvering needed to succeed was the window between Catherine's death and the moment when Wallis could arrange to be present in Herman's life in a form that proximity and history and the specific quality of their connection would make decisive. If you're hooked on this story, make sure to subscribe and turn on notifications so you never miss an upload. Your support means everything and helps me bring you more emotional stories like this one. Wallis's response to Lucy I's campaign was the response that Andrew Morton documented through interviews with Lucy's daughter-in-law, Kitty Blair, who spent many hours alone with Lucy, discussing Herman and Wallis across the decades that followed. Both wanted Herman, Lucy told Kitty Blair. Wallis would have grabbed him and told the Duke to go. Lucy knew that, and the knowledge was the knowledge that organized her entire management of the situation, which was the management of someone preventing an outcome they could see coming. She put pressure on Herman to marry her before Wallis could reach the position where marriage to Herman was the thing she was working toward. The pressure worked, in the specific way that pressure from a woman who is present works on a man who is grieving and kind and susceptible to the comfort of proximity, and who has not yet been reached by the woman who is not present but whose letter has been in transit since he buried his wife. Herman married Lucy I in 1950. Wallis's response to the marriage was the response of someone for whom the specific form of composed public management that the exile years had developed in her failed, for the first time and only briefly, to contain what was behind it. She gave the couple a wedding gift of an engraved silver tray with only Herman's name on it. The omission of Lucy's name from the engraving was not an accident of the silversmith or an oversight of the shop. It was the most precise available expression of a feeling that the social conventions of the occasion required to be suppressed, delivered in the form of a gift so that it could be delivered at all, and understood by every person who received it and who understood the situation as the statement it was. Lucy Rogers received the tray. She understood what she was receiving. The exchange that followed, which Morton reconstructed from Lucy's own account given to Kitty Blair, is the exchange that the Margaret script introduced briefly and that this account provides in full, because it is the most complete single document of Wallis's private feeling that the surviving record contains. At some point after the marriage, in an encounter between the two women that the accounts place in the social world they both inhabited, Wallis told Lucy, "I'll hold you responsible if anything ever happens to Herman. He's the only man I've ever loved." Lucy's response was the response of a woman who had maneuvered across the preceding year in full awareness of exactly what she was maneuvering against, and who had won the maneuvering and was prepared to acknowledge what she had won against. "You have got your king, but I have got your Herman." The exchange was witnessed by people who repeated it, and it has entered the biographical record in the form of two women speaking to each other with the specific directness that the social conventions of their world normally required them not to deploy, and the directness was possible precisely because both of them understood the situation in terms that the conventional social vocabulary could not contain. Herman Rogers died in 1957, 7 years after his marriage to Lucy, and 33 years after he and Wallis had shared a courtyard house in Peking. He died in the south of France, at Louviers, the villa where Wallis had accepted Ernest Simpson's proposal by telegram in 1927, and where she had taken refuge in the days after the abdication, and where the honeymooning Windsors had spent the first winter of their marriage in his and Catherine's company. The connections between the villa and the largest events of Wallis's adult life were the connections of a life organized at its moments of maximum significance, around the gravitational center of the person whose death at Louviers now removed the center entirely. The Duke was alive in 1957. He was 63, in reasonable health, managing the Paris household and the Café Society calendar and the golf at St. Cloud. He was, by every public account of the period, still the man Wallis was married to, and still the person around whom the performance of the century's great love story organized itself. He was not the person around whose death she organized the grief that Herman's death produced in her, and the grief, documented in the accounts of the people who were close to her in the months following Herman's death, was the grief that was disproportionate again, in the same direction as the grief at Catherine's death had been disproportionate, toward the thing that was being lost, rather than the person who had died. What was being lost in 1957 was the last available relationship with the person she had always actually wanted, and the loss was permanent in a way that Catherine's death had been, for a year, provisional. She told people, in the private register, that the Paris years had developed and refined, that Herman had been the one she loved, not one of the ones she had loved, with the softening that the enumeration provides. The one. The statement was made to different people in different contexts across the years following Herman's death, and was consistent enough in its substance across those different occasions to have the weight of something she had stopped pretending was not true, rather than something she was newly saying. The statement's consistency is the most complete available evidence of the private account of a marriage that the public account was required to contradict for as long as both parties to it were alive. The memoir was the instrument through which Wallis was required to publicly contradict it, and the memoir's production is the piece of the private record that most precisely illuminates the distance between what she was willing to say and what the institution of the marriage required her to say. Cleveland Amory, the American writer engaged to ghost the memoir in the mid-1950s, spent months working with Wallis on the material that would become The Heart Has Its Reasons, and his subsequent account of the collaboration, given in interviews across the following decades, described an experience of working with a subject whose actual material resisted the portrait the subject required the material to produce. Amory found, in the conversations that were supposed to generate the memoir's content, a woman whose honest account of her life was not the account that the memoir needed to be, and whose honest account included an understanding of her marriage that the memoir required to be replaced with a different understanding, and who could not or would not produce the replacement in a form that Amory found workable. He left the project. Charles Murphy, who had already ghosted the Duke's own memoir, completed the job with the professional resignation of someone who understood that the ghost's function was to produce what the subject required, rather than what the subject's actual experience contained. The Heart Has Its Reasons was published in 1956 and received with the mixture of commercial interest and critical skepticism that celebrity memoirs receive when the critics have access to enough of the surrounding record to understand the distance between what the memoir contains and what the actual life was. The memoir contained the love story, the romantic account, the version organized around the romantic sacrifice and the settled happiness of exile. It contained almost nothing of Felixstowe and nothing of Herman Rogers that exceeded the vocabulary of friendship. It contained the performance of the marriage rather than the experience of it, and the performance was polished to the standard that the Paris years had developed, which was the standard of someone who had been performing the same material for 2 decades and had achieved the specific smoothness that long performance produces in material that the performer has stopped believing. Ernest Simpson's letters from Wallis in the years after the wedding, the grief correspondence from Felixstowe, and the subsequent communications that the biographies have drawn on in the portions that reach the public record are the private counterpart to the memoir's public performance, and the 2 documents together describe the specific gap between what she was required to say and what she actually felt in the terms that this account has been assembling since its first sentence. The public document says, love, sacrifice, happiness, no regrets. The private documents say, earnest, Herman, terrified, trapped, too much. The 2 documents were produced by the same person at roughly the same period of her life, and the gap between them is the gap that the palace managed and the institution required, and the romantic account was built to prevent from becoming visible. The Duke outlived Herman by 15 years, dying in 1972, at the age of 77, in the borrowed villa in the Bois de Boulogne. Wallis outlived him by 14 years, dying in 1986, in the same villa, confined to her room, her mind failing, her visitors managed by Maître Bloom, in the specific captivity that this account's companion examined in the preceding Windsor script. What the companion script examined from outside the marriage's private feeling, this part has been examining from inside it, and the inside tells the same story that the outside told from a different angle, which is the story of a marriage that was the wrong marriage for at least one of the people inside it, conducted across 35 years with the professional competence of two people who understood that the marriage's public continuation was the one thing that justified both of their positions in the world, and who maintained the continuation at the cost of whatever the continuation cost the people paying for it. The cost, for Wallis, was Herman, and everything Herman represented, the life she had organized around wanting, rather than around the wanting that organized itself around her. The Duke had wanted her. She had wanted Herman. The Duke had abdicated for the wanting, and the abdication had made the wanting's object impossible to escape, and the impossibility had produced 35 years of the performance of the greatest love story of the century, maintained with sufficient thoroughness that the performance is still what most of the world understands the story to have been. What the private record understands it to have been is in the letters to Ernest from Felixstowe, and the silver tray with only one name, and the thing she said to Lucy Rogers, and the grief that was disproportionate twice in the same direction, and the memoir that the first ghostwriter found unworkable, and the word she used to friends about the man she had married, which was the word too much, and the word she used about the man she had not, which was the word only. The woman who became Queen Elizabeth, the Queen Mother, in February 1952, had been conducting her private war against the Windsors since December 1936, and the war had the specific quality of campaigns conducted by people who understand that the most durable victories are the ones that do not require the victor to acknowledge that a contest has occurred. She never publicly criticized Wallis Simpson in the 50 years that followed the abdication. She never issued a statement, gave an interview, or permitted a member of her household to speak on the record about her feelings toward the woman her brother-in-law had married. What she did instead was exercise, through the specific mechanisms that her position made available, a sustained and systematic management of the Windsors' relationship to the institution that had produced the man she held responsible for the death of the life she and her husband had planned before December 1936, imposed a different one on them both. The responsibility was the assignment of a woman who had watched her husband's health deteriorate under the weight of a role he had not wanted and had not been prepared for, and who had connected the deterioration to its cause with the directness that direct causes warrant. George VI had been a shy, stammering man of genuine decency who had been handed the most demanding public role in the world by the departure of the person the role had been built for, and who had performed the role across the 16 years of his reign with a sustained personal courage that the biographers have consistently documented, and that his death at 56, worn through by the war and the smoking and the specific physical cost of the public performance of composure across 16 years, confirmed as courage rather than as ease. His wife had watched all of it, from the inside, and the watching had produced a settled conviction about its author that no subsequent development in the author's life was going to dislodge. Philip Ziegler, given access to the Royal Archives for the authorized biography of the Duke of Windsor published in 1990, was permitted to quote from George VI's private letters about his brother, and the letters that Ziegler quoted provide the most direct available evidence of the institutional position that the new king had established toward his predecessor within months of the abdication. They are not the letters of a man managing a difficult family situation with diplomatic equanimity. They are the letters of someone who felt what had been done to him and said so in private with the directness that the private register permitted. George VI wrote to his mother in the months following the abdication about the deception over the financial settlement, using language that Ziegler characterized as reflecting genuine fury at the discovery that the man who had pleaded relative poverty to extract his settlement had been concealing a fortune. He wrote about the allowance's conditions and his brother's failure to meet them in ways that accumulated across the years into a correspondence of sustained grievance between a mother and a son who had been left to manage the consequences of what a third person had done. The allowance was the instrument through which the family's institutional management of the exile was most precisely conducted, because the allowance was a financial dependency, and financial dependencies are the clearest available expression of one party's power over another in a relationship between parties of unequal institutional standing. The allowance came from George VI's private income rather than from the Crown estate, which meant it was a personal gift from a brother rather than an institutional entitlement. And personal gifts from brothers can be conditional in ways that institutional entitlements cannot. The conditions were the conditions that the abdication settlement had established. The Duke would receive the money so long as he remained outside Britain, unless specifically invited, and the invitation was the instrument through which the family could control the Duke's access to the country without issuing a formal prohibition that would require public acknowledgement. The invitation was withheld across the years of the marriages with the consistency of an institutional policy rather than the variability of a family's social calendar, and the withholding produced the specific situation this account's companion examined from the exile's perspective, which was the situation of a former King of England writing letters to his brother and then to his niece, requesting roles and employment, and acknowledgement that the responses to the letters consistently declined to provide. What this account adds, from inside the institution rather than from the exile, is the specific mechanism through which the declining was managed, which was not the mechanism of explicit prohibition, but the mechanism of the conditions that the allowance imposed, and that the Duke's consistent failure to meet gave the family the institutional justification for maintaining, without the institutional embarrassment of appearing to maintain it. The Duke's failure to meet the conditions was not always the failure of someone who was ignoring the conditions. It was sometimes the failure of someone who was trying to meet them and finding the conditions designed in a way that made meeting them structurally difficult, and the design was the design that the family's management of the situation required, which was the design of conditions that kept the Duke outside Britain without requiring the family to formally prohibit his entry. The mechanism was elegant in the way that institutional mechanisms designed to achieve a specific outcome while appearing to operate on neutral principles are elegant, and the elegance was the product of the legal and diplomatic intelligence that the Queen Mother and her advisers applied to the management of a situation they had decided must be managed indefinitely. The Queen Mother's own management of her personal interactions with the Windsors, in the situations where the family calendar and the social world produced unavoidable proximity, was the management of someone who had developed the specific skill of treating a person with the minimum warmth required by the occasion, while communicating through every other available channel that the minimum was precisely what it was. People who observed her at the occasions where the Windsors were present and she was required to acknowledge their presence described what they observed in the vocabulary of performance. A woman performing the warmth appropriate to the occasion, with the precision of performance rather than the naturalness of feeling, and with the specific quality that distinguishes performed warmth from genuine warmth, which is that it stops the moment the occasion that requires it stops. The performance was technically flawless. The people who received it knew, and she knew they knew, and the knowledge was the communication. Tommy Lascelles, who had served first as the Duke's assistant private secretary, and then as private secretary to George VI, and subsequently to Elizabeth II, maintained across the years of his service the private assessment of the Duke that he had communicated to Ramsay MacDonald in 1927, and the assessment was maintained in the form of the institutional file on the Duke that accumulated across the years of the exile. Lascelles was the person in the royal household who held the longest continuous institutional memory of the Duke's character and conduct, and who communicated that memory through the private channels of courtiers' correspondence in terms that shaped the institutional management of the Windsors across the decades of the exile without ever entering the public record in a form that could be cited as the institutional position. His diaries, published after his death under the title King's Counsellor, contain the private record of his assessment across the years he served the family, and the assessment is consistent from the 1920s through the 1960s, in the way that assessments formed from direct professional observation, rather than from ideological position, tend to be consistent, which is with the specific weight of someone who has seen the evidence and reached the conclusion that the evidence supports. The Princess Margaret dimension of the institutional war is the dimension that the palace's management was least able to control, because Margaret had her own relationship to both the Duke and the Duchess that was partially independent of the institutional position, and the independence periodically expressed itself in ways that the institution found inconvenient. Margaret had known Edward as her father's brother across her childhood, in the specific way that children know their parents' absent siblings, which is the way of the holiday and the formal occasion rather than the daily proximity, and the knowing had produced in her a complex of feeling that the institutional position required her to suppress, and that she suppressed with varying degrees of completeness across the decades. She told people she trusted, in the private communications that her friends preserved, that she felt sorry for Wallis. The statement was made more than once, to more than one person, in terms that the sources available to the biographers describe as genuine rather than diplomatic, and the genuine quality of the feeling was the quality that the institution had the least purchase on, because feelings are not managed by institutional mechanisms in the same way that social occasions and allowances and invitation calendars are managed. The specific feeling that produced the sympathy is reconstructed from what the sources allow, which is less than full certainty, but more than speculation. Margaret had watched her mother conduct the sustained management of the Windsors across the years of her own adult life, and had watched it from the position of someone who understood her mother's reasons and who could not entirely endorse the methods that the reasons had produced, in the way that children who love their parents sometimes cannot endorse the methods that the parents' most strongly held convictions produce, when the convictions are strong enough to override the ordinary human recognition of the costs the methods impose on others. The others, in this case, were Wallis and Edward, and whatever Wallis had done and whatever Edward had done, Margaret's private record suggests she was never entirely persuaded that the decades of managed exile were a response proportionate to the provocation. Her sympathy did not translate into action. The institutional constraints on Margaret's own position, examined in the companion account of her life, were sufficient to prevent her private feeling from becoming the kind of intervention that would have required the institution to acknowledge it and respond to it. She sent no private overtures to Wallis that the record contains. She made no visit to Paris independently of the occasions the family calendar created for it. What she communicated to the people she trusted was the private record of a feeling, and the private record is what the companion account drew on, and what this account adds is the institutional context that the feeling existed inside, which is the context of a family whose management of its most inconvenient members had been refined over 30 years into a precision instrument that the genuine feelings of individual members of the family had insufficient leverage to displace. The displacement was never attempted from inside the institution in any organized form across the years of the exile, and the absence of the attempt is itself the evidence of the management's success, because the management's success was defined precisely as the condition in which the institutional consensus around the exile's maintenance was sufficiently durable to survive the individual members' private feelings without those feelings producing the kind of organized challenge that would have required the consensus to defend itself publicly. The consensus survived, the exile was maintained, the allowance remained conditional, the invitations remained withheld or granted on terms the institution set. The warmth at the unavoidable occasions remained performed rather than felt, and the Duke and Duchess continued in the borrowed house among the trees, conducting their public performance of the great love story against the specific backdrop of an institution that had decided, in December 1936, that the performance was the most it was prepared to offer the two people it was watching perform it, and that had maintained that decision with the specific consistency of an institution that had made a choice and was not going to revise it. George VI died in February 1952, having never resolved the relationship with his brother into the warmth that several of the people who observed both men across the years of the exile believed both of them wanted, and neither of them knew how to achieve, in the presence of the institution that had organized itself around their estrangement. The organization of the institution around the estrangement is what prevented the resolution, and the institution that organized itself around it was the institution that the Queen Mother managed, and that Lascelles served, and that the allowance conditions expressed, and the management of all of it was the private war whose conduct never appeared in any public statement, and whose effectiveness was measured in the decades of the exile, rather than in the victories of any single engagement. The decades produced what the institution required them to produce. The specific form of managed obsolescence that is the institution's preferred outcome for its most inconvenient former members, in which the inconvenience diminishes across the years, until the person producing it is no longer capable of producing it, and the institution can perform the appropriate ceremonies of grief, and then return to the version of its history that the management had always been maintaining. The ceremonies were performed in May and June of 1972, and they were performed with the technical perfection that the institution brings to ceremonies it has been preparing for years, and then the institution returned to what it had always been, and the Duke's file was closed, and the war that had never been publicly acknowledged as a war was over, with the outcome the institution had always intended, which was the outcome in which the institution outlasted the inconvenience and required no public acknowledgement of either. In the days immediately following the abdication, the man who had been King of England for 326 days sat down with his brother's representatives and negotiated the terms of his departure with the specific attention to financial detail that would characterize every significant transaction of the following 35 years. He told his brother that his private fortune amounted to approximately £90,000. He told his brother this in the context of the negotiation over the financial settlement that his departure from the throne required, and he told it with the specific emphasis of someone whose financial argument depended on the figure being accepted as accurate. The figure was not accurate. Philip Ziegler, working from the Royal Archives for the authorized biography, established that the Duke's actual private fortune at the time of the abdication was in excess of £1 million, accumulated across the 25 years of his time as Prince of Wales from the revenues of the Duchy of Cornwall, which were the revenues of the specific mechanism by which the heir to the British throne accumulates private wealth while performing the public function that generates the popularity that makes the public function worth performing. The Duchy of Cornwall generated, across the years of Edward's tenure as Prince of Wales, a net income that the estimates of the biographers who have examined the financial records place between £60,000 and £80,000 per year at the period's values, and across 25 years of that income, accumulated without the specific requirements of the kind of expenditure that subsequent heirs to the throne maintained, the accumulation had produced the figure that Ziegler established from the archive and that the Duke had represented to his brother in the negotiation of the terms of his own financial future as 1/11th of its actual size. The misrepresentation was not the error of a man who had lost track of his finances. It was the deliberate construction of a picture designed to extract a settlement whose terms the accurate picture would not have supported. The settlement the misrepresentation extracted was the sale of the Duke's life interest in Sandringham and Balmoral, the two royal houses that he had occupied as Prince of Wales, and that the abdication would otherwise have left in his access without his having any claim to them, and a private allowance from George VI's own income, initially set at approximately £21,000 per year, and subsequently renegotiated across the years of the exile, as the relationship between the brothers produced the specific texture of a financial relationship between a man who was paying and a man who was receiving, and both of whom were managing the payment and the receipt, in terms shaped by what each knew about the other's actual position. George VI discovered the deception. The discovery was not immediate, but it was sufficiently early in the exile years that the letters which Ziegler was permitted to quote reflect a man who had found out that the financial argument his brother had made to him in December 1936 had been constructed on false premises, and who was processing the discovery with the fury of someone who had been deceived by the person whose claim on his generosity had been the basis of the settlement. The fury was managed, as the other furies produced by the Duke's conduct were managed, through the private channels that the family applied to situations it was not prepared to address publicly. It was managed in the form of the conditions that the allowance subsequently acquired, the specific requirement that the Duke remain outside Britain unless specifically invited, which was the condition that converted the allowance from a straightforward gift into the instrument of the exile's maintenance that Part 7 of this account described. The connection between the financial deception and the condition is the connection that the public account of the exile has never assembled with precision. because the public account of the exile did not have access to the financial records that Ziegler assembled from the archive. And the financial records are the specific evidence that the condition was not merely a constitutional arrangement about a former sovereign's relationship to his country, but a response to a specific financial deception whose discovery had given the family a private justification for an arrangement that the public account required to be presented in constitutional terms. The Duke's relationship to money in the years of the exile was the relationship of someone who had resolved the dissonance between his experience of wealth and his representation of himself as financially constrained by eliminating the dissonance at the level of behavior rather than at the level of the representation. The representation continued. He told friends and acquaintances across the exile years that he was not a rich man, that the costs of the household exceeded the income that the allowance and the investments provided, that the lifestyle the Duchess required was a financial burden that the family's management of his affairs had left him insufficiently equipped to meet. The behavior told a different story, or rather the behavior told the story that the representation required not to be told, which was the story of a man whose actual resources included not merely the allowance and the investments, but the tax exemption from the French government, the nominal rent for the villa from the city of Paris, the customs privileges that allowed the household's purchases to avoid the duties that the French authorities would otherwise have levied, and the social infrastructure of people who paid for the company of the former King of England in the specific form of the hospitality that his social presence generated for its providers. The tax exemption was not a small thing. A man with a fortune in excess of £1 million accumulated additional capital from the sale of his Sandringham and Balmoral interests, income from the allowance, income from the memoir serialization rights sold to Life magazine for sums that contemporaries estimated in the hundreds of thousands of dollars, and income from the investments managed by his advisors across the decades, was receiving all of these without paying French income tax on any of them. The exemption was extended, and extended again, across the years of the exile, without any French government of any political character declining to renew it, because the political cost of declining to extend a courtesy to the former King of England was not a cost that any French politician found worth bearing for the principle of it. The courtesy was renewed and the fortune grew, and the Duke continued to describe himself to his social world as a man of modest means who was finding the costs of the exile difficult to manage. The household accounts that the biographers have examined through the testimony of the staff and the evidence of the domestic records that staff members subsequently discussed support the specific picture of a household whose financial management reflected the Duke's attitude toward money in the form that that attitude most clearly took in the privacy of the domestic environment. The attitude of someone who regarded money as a resource to be extracted from every available source and conserved in every available direction, except the directions that the performance of the great love story required. The directions that the performance required were the directions of the Duchess's couture and the household's table, and the entertainment of the guests, whose presence at the dinners was the validation of the court in exile's continued relevance. The directions that the conservation was applied to were the directions of the people who produced the performance, the staff, whose wages ran below the Paris market rate for comparable positions in comparable households, and whose below-market wages were the specific domestic expression of the financial management that the public representation of modest means had always required. The Duchess's jewelry, which this account has established in its companion as the commercial instrument of the exile's financing and the evidence of the marriage's public claim to romance, was also in Wallis's own understanding of it, something more specific than either. Her letters from the pre-abdication period and from the exile's early years, in the portions that have been published and examined by the biographers, contain references to the jewelry that carry the specific register of someone who understood the jewelry as insurance rather than as ornament. She had grown up without money, in the specific way that women from genteel American families of reduced circumstances grow up without money, which is the way of sufficient appearances and insufficient reserves, and the education that growing up in that condition provides is the education of someone who understands that appearances are maintained by resources, and that resources can disappear, and that the time to build the insurance is before the disaster rather than during it. The jewelry was the insurance. It was beautiful, and it was wearable, and it was the specific form of portable wealth that a woman in an uncertain social position converts her access to a wealthy partner's resources into, when the uncertain social position includes the possibility that the wealthy partner's family might, at any point, find a mechanism for reducing the resources that the partner's position made available. The specific pieces that the insurance accumulated across the exile years tell the story of the insurance's construction more precisely than any general account of the collection managers. The flamingo brooch, the panther bracelet, the pieces inscribed with the couple's private codes of anniversaries and endearments, were not merely the gifts of a devoted husband to an adored wife. They were the conversion, in a form that French and Swiss banking systems found administratively convenient and that customs officials found difficult to value precisely, of the income streams that the exile generated into the portable assets that a woman who had been through 2 divorces and a constitutional crisis understood she might need to have available, independent of the goodwill of the man who was currently providing them. The collection was, in the vocabulary of financial planning, rather than the vocabulary of romance, a diversified asset portfolio held in wearable form, and Wallis's management of it across the exile years was the management of someone who understood this without being required to say it. The Duke's own financial management of the household's relationships with the outside world produced, across the years of the exile, a pattern of behavior that the people who experienced it from the receiving end described with the consistency of people who have been surprised by the same thing in the same person in different contexts. The pattern was the pattern of non-payment, bills allowed to accumulate beyond the periods that the relevant suppliers would have permitted from clients of less famous names, checks that arrived after the date on which the commercial relationship required them, and the specific social dynamic of dinners and entertainments whose costs were absorbed by the hosts, without the hosts being under any formal obligation to absorb them, and without the Duke showing any consistent inclination to notice that he was not the one absorbing them. The people who hosted the Windsors in the years of the exile understood, eventually, that the hosting was the price of the access, and the access to the former King of England was worth the price to the people who valued it highly enough, and the people who did not value it highly enough eventually stopped hosting, and the Duke noted their absence in the private manner of someone who had been accustomed to being sought rather than to seeking, and who found the experience of not being sought an injustice rather than a consequence. The financial architecture of the exile, assembled from the tax exemption and the nominal rent and the customs privileges and the below-market wages and the social infrastructure of people who paid in hospitality for the privilege of royal company, was the architecture of a lifestyle whose true cost was substantially borne by parties other than the couple who lived it, and whose borne cost by those parties was never acknowledged in the terms that would have made the acknowledgement uncomfortable. The parties bore the cost because the cost was the price they had decided to pay for what they were getting, and what they were getting was not merely the company of interesting people at good tables, but the specific status that proximity to the former King of England conferred in the social world that valued the proximity. The status was real. The status was worth money to the people who valued it. The Duke understood this, and managed the understanding with the specific efficiency of someone who had spent 41 years being the person whose company conferred status, and who had learned, across those years, the specific skill of extracting from the status-conferring relationship the resources that the extraction generated, without the extracting requiring formal acknowledgement of what the relationship's terms actually were. The terms, assembled from the financial records and the staff testimony, and the household accounts, and the tax exemption documents, and the customs privileges, and the social testimony of the people who hosted and were hosted across 35 years, produced a picture of the exile's financial reality that the romantic account of the great love story had always required not to exist, because the romantic account required the exile to be the product of love rather than of financial management, and the financial management was the specific tool through which two people in a situation of institutional disadvantage constructed for themselves the resources that the institution's management of the situation was designed to prevent them from accumulating. The construction was accomplished. The resources accumulated. The management was sustained across 35 years with the efficiency of people who had identified the available channels and who worked them without public acknowledgement of the working. The working is in the record. For anyone who reads the record in the direction of the financial management rather than the direction of the love story. The love story is easier to read and more satisfying, and tells a better tale. The financial management tells the more accurate one, and the more accurate one is the one this account has been building toward from the first of the 15 parts that examine what the palace never admitted about the marriage it spent 35 years managing at a distance. Freda Dudley Ward received a telephone call from Fort Belvedere in the spring of 1934 that was not from the Prince of Wales. It was from the Fort Belvedere switchboard operator, and its content was the most precise available communication of what had changed in the prince's primary attachment without anyone being required to state the change directly. The switchboard operator told Freda that she had instructions not to put her calls through. The instructions had arrived from the household. The household's instructions reflected the preferences of the household's master. After 16 years of daily contact, of letters and calls, and the specific texture of the most sustained, intimate relationship of Edward's adult life, the connection was ended by a switchboard operator reading from a list. Freda Dudley Ward had been the organizing center of Edward's emotional life since 1918, when he had met her during an air raid at a party in London, and pursued her with the nursery register letters that this account's 5th part has examined. She was married throughout to William Dudley Ward, a Liberal MP, and the marriage was the specific kind of Edwardian upper-class marriage that the period produced in quantity, organized around the mutual understanding that both parties occupied their positions and maintained their social functions without requiring of each other the emotional exclusivity that a different kind of marriage might demand. The arrangement suited Edward's position precisely, because a woman who was not free to marry him was a woman who could not demand that he formalize the attachment, and the formalization was the demand that Edward had been avoiding since young manhood. He avoided it with Freda across 16 years, during which she raised his daughters alongside her daughters from her marriage, and managed his emotional requirements, and received his letters, and maintained the specific relationship that the letters document, which was the relationship of a woman who had accepted that the man she was attached to would always be more attached to her than she was to him, and who had organized her own emotional life around the management of his requirements, rather than around the expression of her own. She was, by the accounts of people who knew her in those years, a woman of considerable personal quality, intelligent, warm, genuinely kind, and possessed of the specific social intelligence that the management of a prince's emotional requirements across 16 years requires and develops. She was also, by the accounts of the same people, a woman who had spent 16 years giving more to a relationship than the relationship returned, and who had made the accommodation so thoroughly that the accommodation had become the relationship rather than the arrangement around it. The switchboard call ended it in a single afternoon. She never spoke to Edward again. She outlived him by 12 years, dying in 1983, and maintained across all of those years the specific silence of someone who has decided that the experience she carries does not require the world's examination. She gave no interviews. She published no memoir. She received no acknowledgement from the institution whose heir she had managed for 16 years, and no acknowledgement from the man she had managed. Edward's memoir, published in 1951, mentioned her in passing as a friend of the period, in the register of someone performing a required acknowledgement of a relationship's existence, while removing from the acknowledgement every piece of content that the relationship had actually contained. What the 16 years had contained, in the specific dimension relevant to the marriage this account is examining, was the formation of the specific attachment pattern that Edward would replicate with Wallis across the following 35 years. The nursery diction, the self-diminishment, the telephone frequency, the jealousy of her other relationships, the specific demand for a totality of attention that no woman with her own life could provide, were all present in the Freda relationship in the form that the Freda letters document, and they were all replicated in the Wallis relationship with the consistency of someone whose attachment style was not the product of a specific woman, but of a specific formation that the specific women encountered across the years were required to manage. Wallis managed it differently from Freda, because Wallis had a different formation and different resources, and the difference is the difference between a woman who accommodated the attachment across 16 years without apparent exhaustion and a woman who found it suffocating within years of the wedding. The women between Freda and Wallis in the period when the Frida relationship was still formally in existence, but had begun to be supplemented by Edward's attention to other women, are documented in the accounts of the period with varying degrees of specificity. Lady Furness occupied the primary position from 1930, overlapping with Frida across the period when the Frida relationship was declining without having formally ended, and her own tenure lasted until 1934, when the bread incident at Fort Belvedere established the transfer to Wallis in terms that Part 5 of this account has already examined. What is relevant here and has not been examined is the specific quality of what the transition between Frida and Thelma and Wallis tells about Edward's relationship to women as a category rather than to any specific woman, which is that the category was organized around the requirement for a manager, and the specific women who occupied the primary position were interchangeable in the functional sense that the managing requirement could be met by any woman of sufficient social skill and sufficient willingness to meet it, while being irreplaceable in the emotional sense that each departure produced in Edward the specific crisis of the person who has lost the manager they depended on. The crisis produced by the anticipated loss of Wallis, which was the crisis of the abdication, was the most extreme expression of the pattern rather than an anomaly within it, and the extremity was the extremity of a man who had identified in this particular manager qualities that made her harder to replace than her predecessors had been, and who had reached the specific conclusion that the management of the replacement crisis was less desirable than the abdication, and who had executed the abdication without the adequate consultation of the person being managed that the execution required. What Edward did during the marriage, with the pattern that the preceding attachments had established, is documented in the accounts of the social world the couple occupied, in terms that the romantic account of the exile has always managed by treating the social world's testimony as the gossip of people who were not sufficiently inside the marriage to know its actual content. The management is itself a piece of evidence, because the romantic account's dismissal of social testimony is precisely what the romantic account requires when the social testimony is inconsistent with the romantic account, and the inconsistency is the indicator of the testimony's relevance rather than its dismissal. The specific names that the social world's testimony attached to Edward's extramarital interests across the exile years are the names that the biographies handle with the appropriate qualification that named allegations without documentary confirmation require, and this account handles them with the same qualification, while noting that the pattern the names represent is documented with sufficient consistency across independent accounts to constitute the corroborated picture of a pattern, rather than the uncorroborated allegation of individual incidents. The pattern was the pattern of the man who had organized his emotional life around a series of managing women whose management he simultaneously required and resented, and whose resentment expressed itself, across the exile years, in the specific behavior of someone who sought in the social world around him the validation that the marriage's private dynamic had ceased to provide. Lady Alexandra Metcalfe, the wife of the Duke's closest English friend Fruity Metcalfe, observed the couple across the years of the exile with the specific proximity of someone who was inside their social world without being inside the marriage, and her observations, preserved in her private letters and subsequently drawn on by the biographers who examined the exile, describe a dynamic that she found more comfortable to document in the private register of personal correspondence than in any form that required attribution. She wrote to her husband about the marriage's texture in terms that combined genuine affection for both parties with the specific unease of someone who could see, from the inside of their social world, what the public performance of the marriage was managing, and the managing included the Duke's behavior in company with women who were not the Duchess, in ways that Metcalfe's letters described, with the diplomatic indirection that the period and the friendship required. The diplomatic indirection of Metcalfe's letters is the specific form that the available evidence for this dimension of the marriage's private reality takes, which is the form of the account that is just specific enough to establish the pattern and just unspecific enough to maintain the relationship that produced the account. It is the form of evidence that the romantic version of the marriage has always found easiest to dismiss, precisely because its diplomatic quality gives the dismissal's advocates the cover of the account's imprecision, and the cover is sufficient for the dismissal, but not for the historical record. And the historical record is what this account is building. Wallis's own documented awareness of what was occurring in the social world around her is contained in the private communications that the biographies drew on, and her awareness was the awareness of a woman who had been managing a jealous and possessive man for decades, and who understood, from that specific formation, the specific irony of finding herself on the receiving end of a behavior that the man's jealousy had never permitted him to acknowledge he was capable of. The irony was the irony of the double standards operation inside the marriage's specific conditions. The Duke who monitored Wallis's friendships with men, with the vigilance that Part 5 of this account described, was the same Duke whose own behavior in the social world, the marriage occupied, was characterized by the freedom from reciprocal monitoring that his institutional position within the marriage made available to him. His position was the primary position. Her position was the managed position. The managing included the monitoring of her social connections in ways that the monitored person could observe and document and communicate to people she trusted without the monitoring's existence being publicly acknowledged, because public acknowledgement would have required the acknowledgement of the dynamic that produced it, and the dynamic was inconsistent with the performance of the century's great mutual devotion that both parties were publicly committed to maintaining. What each knew about the other across the exile years, assembled from the accounts that have reached the public record in the form of private letters and social testimony, and the observations of the people who were inside the social world that contained the marriage, was more than the romantic version of the marriage acknowledged, and less than the most hostile readings of the exile years claimed. Each knew that the other was conducting the marriage in the specific terms that the marriage's conditions had produced, and the conditions had produced a marriage in which the public performance of devoted partnership coexisted with a private reality of two people managing their own separate relationships to the specific quality of life that the exile had made available. And the management was the marriage, and the marriage was maintained because both parties understood that the alternative to the maintenance was the exposure of what the performance had been managing, and the exposure was something neither party could afford. The specific person who could afford it least was the one who had the most to lose from the exposure, and the most to lose was the Duke's, because the Duke's entire justification for the abdication was the marriage's success, and the marriage's success was the only available defense against the specific verdict that the abdication without the successful marriage would produce, which was the verdict of a man who had destroyed a throne for a personal preference that had not even sustained itself. The marriage therefore had to be maintained at whatever personal cost the maintenance required, and the personal cost was borne, and the performing of the maintenance continued, and the performance was maintained until the performance could not be performed any longer, because the performers were too old and too ill to perform it, and even then the performance had sufficient institutional momentum to continue in the form of the legend that the performance had produced, which is the form in which it has continued to the present, and which this account has been examining from the angle that the performance was designed to prevent. The angle is the angle of what each knew and what the knowing produced in the people who carried it, and the carrying produced, in the Duke, the specific loneliness of someone who has organized his entire existence around another person and who cannot, in the end, reach the person he has organized himself around, and who cannot leave, and who cannot say this, and who dies in the condition of the unreachable, reaching. And in the Duchess, the specific loneliness of someone who has been reached by a person she did not choose and cannot leave, and who carries, in the private account that this account has been assembling, the name of the person she did choose and could not reach, and who carries it with the specific weight of something that has no resolution and requires no public acknowledgement, and is therefore carried privately, which is the heaviest possible way to carry it, from the courtyard house in Peking to the borrowed villa in the Bois de Boulogne, across the 60 years between the arriving and the ending. In 1934, while Wallis Simpson was managing her deepening relationship with the Prince of Wales and her increasingly complicated marriage to Ernest, she underwent an operation in London whose nature the biographers who have examined her medical history have described with varying degrees of certainty and varying degrees of discretion. The operation is documented in the sense that it occurred and that it produced a medical outcome, and the medical outcome is documented in the sense that Wallis did not, across the subsequent 38 years of her life, conceive a child. The connection between the operation and the outcome is the connection that the biographers have assembled from the available evidence, rather than from direct medical documentation. Because the direct medical documentation is in the category of records that have not entered the public archive in a form accessible to independent examination, and the available evidence is the evidence of what people who knew Wallis said about the situation, rather than what the treating physicians recorded. Anne Seber, whose examination of the evidence in That Woman, published in 2011, is among the most careful available, described the operation as most likely a hysterectomy, or a procedure that produced the same outcome, and described the evidence for this conclusion as the combination of Wallis's own references to the procedure in private correspondence, the testimony of people who were in contact with her medical situation at the time, and the absence of any subsequent pregnancy in a woman who was, from 1937 onward, in a stable marriage with a man who by multiple accounts wanted an heir and had no documented fertility problem of his own. The absence is not itself proof, because marriages that produce no children can fail to produce them for many reasons, and the reasons are not always in one party's medical history, but the absence, combined with the private references and the testimony, constitutes the available evidence for the conclusion that Seber reached carefully, and that several biographers before her had reached less carefully. The China dossier, which this account's first part established as the government surveillance document, compiled at Baldwin's direction in 1935, contained claims about Wallis's medical history during her China years that the historians who have examined the dossier's actual contents, to the extent that those contents have been made available, have found considerably less reliable than the claims about her financial motivations and her concurrent affairs. The dossier was described in the testimony of people who claimed to have seen or been briefed on its contents as containing allegations about a 1926 abortion in Shanghai, the procedures having been performed in a context whose details the allegations organized around the specific lurid elements that intelligence reports produced for politicians who need to be convinced of the gravity of a situation tend to organize around. Paul French's careful examination of the China period in his 2024 account found the medical allegations in the dossier to be among the least supported of its various claims, and the forensic historical work of establishing what Wallis actually did and did not do during her Lotus year has consistently produced a woman of considerably more ordinary behavior than the dossier's alleged contents described. What the medical history establishes with reasonable confidence, shorn of the dossier's embellishments, is that Wallis Simpson was not in a position to have children by the time she married Edward in 1937, and that this was a fact known to the people closest to the situation, and that the knowledge shaped the institution's management of the marriage in a specific dimension that the romantic account of the exile has never examined with adequate attention. The institution was a succession institution. It had organized itself across the preceding months of the abdication crisis around the specific problem of a king who was proposing to marry a woman the institution found constitutionally inadmissible as a queen consort, and the constitutional inadmissibility had been argued on the grounds of her 2 divorces and her status as a twice-divorced woman whose former husbands were both still living. The grounds were genuine, but they were not the only grounds, and the other grounds were the grounds that the institution's management of the post-abdication narrative required not to be spoken aloud, which were the grounds that the marriage was in any case unlikely to produce an heir. The succession question organized the family's management of the Windsors in the post-abdication years in the specific dimension that Part 7 of this account described from the perspective of the Queen Mother's sustained campaign, and the childlessness of the marriage was the piece of the succession question that the campaign's management required to be handled in the private register rather than the public one. The private register allowed the observation made by the family and the courtiers in the private communications that the biographies drew on, that the marriage whose disruption of the succession had justified the constitutional crisis had produced nothing by way of a compensating heir that might have offered a parallel succession narrative. The observation was not made publicly, because making it publicly would have required the institution to acknowledge that the childlessness was a subject it had been assessing, and the acknowledgement would have raised questions about what the institution had known and when it had known it, that the institutional management did not want to answer. Edward's own attitude toward children is documented in the accounts of the people who observed him in situations that involved them, and the documentation is the documentation of someone whose engagement with the subject was organized around indifference rather than desire. He was a man who had spent his adult life performing public roles that required his engagement with the public, and the public engagement had produced in him the specific quality of cultivated accessibility that distinguished his tour performances from those of every other royal figure of his generation, and the accessibility extended to the children who were in the crowds he visited with an ease that the photographs document. The accessibility in crowds was the performance. The private engagement with children in the domestic settings that would have been relevant to the question of fatherhood was documented by the people who observed him in those settings in terms that describe someone who found the domestic settings of children less interesting than the public settings, and who communicated his finding through the specific mechanism of the attentive man in public becoming the inattentive one in private. His nieces Elizabeth and Margaret observed him in the specific way that royal children observe prominent adult relatives, through the combination of the formal occasions and the informal ones that proximity within a family institution produces, and the accounts of both women in the years when they spoke about their uncle describe a man whose public charm and private distance were both legible to the children who were in his presence across their childhoods. Elizabeth's account, preserved in the memoir literature of the people who served her and in the accounts of the people who discussed her uncle with her across her long reign, reflects the assessment of a woman who had known Edward across her childhood and adolescence, and who had formed a view of his character from the inside of the family rather than from the outside of the legend. The view was the view of someone who had observed the private man behind the public performance, and who found the two less continuous with each other than the public performance required them to appear. George VI's family life, assembled in the years between 1937 and 1952, was the specific counterexample that the exile's childlessness produced for anyone who was comparing the two branches of the family that the abdication had created. George and Elizabeth had two daughters, and the daughters were raised in the specific domestic environment that their parents had designed around the values of family enclosure and private affection that the king's own upbringing had not provided, and that he had decided his children would receive, regardless of the institutional requirements that might otherwise have colonized the domestic space. The photographs of the family at Sandringham and Balmoral, in the specific informal register that royal family photographs rarely achieve, document the outcome of that decision. Children who were evidently comfortable in their parents' company, a king who was evidently comfortable in his children's company, a domestic life that was genuinely domestic rather than institutionally managed. The contrast with the Windsor's childless exile, two people in a borrowed house in France, managing the performance of the great love story without the specific human content that children provide to the performance of a family, was the contrast that the institution had managed in public by not mentioning it and had noted in private by observing it. The dynastic cost of the abdication, assessed honestly against the succession's subsequent trajectory, was the cost that the institution managed most completely in silence, because the silence was the most efficient management the cost permitted. Edward VIII, had he remained king, would have produced no heir with the woman he married in 1937, and the succession would have required management that the British constitutional framework would have found considerably more complex than the management that George VI's family had provided. The institution that removed him from the throne and replaced him with his brother had, in the specific dimension of the succession that the institution existed to manage, received from the change an outcome better than the alternative that the man it replaced would have produced, and the institution's silence about this dimension of the abdication's consequences was the silence of an organization that had no interest in drawing public attention to the fact that the crisis it had been managed toward a better dynastic outcome than its public justifications acknowledged. Wallis's own relationship to the childlessness, assembled from what the private record allows, is the dimension that the Romance literature has handled most inadequately, because the Romance literature requires the childlessness to be either a source of mutual grief that deepens the bond, or a matter of indifference to two people whose love for each other made the question irrelevant. The evidence supports neither of these readings with any precision. What the evidence supports, in the form of the private communications and the accounts of people close to Wallis across the exile years, is the picture of a woman for whom the question of children had been settled before the marriage, and who had made the settlement with the combination of pragmatism and grief that women who settle such questions before they have the opportunity to resolve them differently make the settlement with. She had wanted, in the specific domestic aspirations she expressed to Ernest Simpson and to Herman Rogers across the years before the abdication, a version of life that included the things that an ordinary domestic life includes, and children were among the things that an ordinary domestic life includes, and the life that the abdication had produced was not an ordinary domestic life, and the absence of the ordinary domestic life's elements, of which the children were one, was the accumulating texture of the specific loss that the letters to Ernest from Felixstowe and the private communications to Herman and the accounts of friends who visited Paris had been documenting since 1936. The Duke never spoke publicly about the childlessness in terms that acknowledged it as a loss. He spoke, in the specific public register of the great love story, about the completeness of the life the marriage had given him, about the sufficiency of the partnership, about the domestic contentment that the exile's publicity apparatus had been managed to produce for every journalist and every documentary crew that had been admitted to the villa in the Bois de Boulogne across the decades. The private register, available in the accounts of the people who knew him well enough to hear what the public register was covering, contained the specific acknowledgement that a man of his formation makes when the domestic expectations of his class and his era have not been met by the life he chose, which is the acknowledgement that exists in the gap between the public performance of sufficiency and the private admission of the specific thing that the sufficiency is required to substitute for. The specific thing, in this case, was a child who would have been the heir to nothing in the legal sense, but who would have given the performance of the century's greatest love story the one piece of human content that the performance had never been able to produce, which was the evidence that the love had made something beyond itself, that it had extended into the generation that follows the generation that loved, that the specific weight of the abdication had been paid for by something whose existence the paying for it had generated. The love had generated a performance. The performance had generated a legend. The legend had generated everything that the legend generates: the books, the films, the documentaries, the dramatizations, the auction records, the commercial deployment of the imagery, the cultural currency of two names and two faces, and a story that the century kept and keeps. What the love had not generated was a child, and the absence of the child is the silence at the center of the legend, the specific emptiness that the legend has been organized around not noticing, and that this part of this account has examined in the terms that the available evidence supports, and that the legend's management required to be treated as a private medical matter rather than as the public dynastic question it also was. In the autumn of 1935, Stanley Baldwin received from the head of the Metropolitan Police's Special Branch a report on Wallis Simpson that contained information the Prime Minister had not requested and that he received with the specific discomfort of a politician who has been given something he cannot act on directly and cannot afford to ignore. The report described, in the professional neutrality of policemen documenting what their surveillance had found, a woman whose concurrent relationships with the Prince of Wales and a married car salesman named Guy Trundle were being maintained simultaneously, whose financial dependency on the Prince was the primary driver of the relationship's management, and whose first marriage had produced in the investigating officers the specific concern of people who had been given access to information that went considerably beyond the current attachments. The first marriage was the dimension of the special branch's knowledge that the public account of the abdication has most consistently failed to examine, not because the knowledge was unavailable to the people who managed the crisis, but because the knowledge was available and was managed in a specific direction that the public account required. Win Spencer's conduct toward Wallis in China had been the conduct described in Part 1 of this account: the beatings, the threats, the forced participation in humiliations that produced in the woman who survived them the specific formation that Part 1 examined. The Special Branch, conducting its surveillance of Wallis from 1934 onward, had access to the reports of the people who had been present in the China years, or who had been told of them by the people who were, and the reports formed part of the file that the surveillance operation produced. The file contained, in other words, the specific evidence that the woman the establishment was organizing to expel from the prince's life had herself been the victim of the kind of conduct that the establishment was not organized to discuss, in the vocabulary that its own social values would have required it to use had it been organized to discuss it. The vocabulary was not deployed. The file was not used in the direction of acknowledging what it documented about Wallis's experience of Win Spencer, because the direction in which the file was deployed was the direction of the establishment's interest in the prince's conduct, rather than the direction of its interest in Wallis's circumstances. The file was a surveillance file on a potential security risk, and the potential security risk was the woman, rather than the marriage she had survived, and the deployment of the file in the direction of the security risk required treating the woman as the risk, rather than as the person who had experienced what the file also documented. The specific management of the available information in the direction that served the institutional interest, rather than the direction that the information itself pointed, is the management that this part of this account is examining, and the examination is the examination of what the palace knew and what it chose to do with the knowing. What Baldwin did with the special branch reports was the specific thing that politicians do with information they receive from intelligence operations that they cannot publicly deploy without acknowledging that the intelligence operation exists. He used the information to inform his private management of the situation without entering it into the public record in the form that would require him to explain how he had obtained it. He knew about Trundle. He knew about the financial dependency. He knew about the China file. He knew about Wallis's first marriage in the specific terms that the special branch's investigation had produced. And he managed his conversations with the king, and his conversations with the press, and his management of the constitutional crisis with the specific advantage of someone who knows more than he is required to say, and who is using the knowing in the direction that the institutional interest requires. The institutional interest required the abdication to be managed as a constitutional question about the monarchy's relationship to divorce and the church, rather than as a question about the specific character of the woman whose presence had precipitated the crisis, because the character question would have required the discussion of the surveillance operation, and the discussion of Trundle, and the discussion of the financial dependency, and the discussion of Win Spencer, and each of those discussions would have produced coverage whose direction the government could not control, and whose tone toward Wallis would have generated a public sympathy that the establishment's management of the crisis did not want generated. It was easier to manage the crisis as the sad necessity of constitutional principle than as the specific drama of a woman who was simultaneously conducting affairs with the heir to the throne and a car salesman for financial reasons, and whose first husband had beaten her in Canton and dragged her to brothels and threatened to kill her. The constitutional framing produced a manageable story. The character framing would have produced an unmanageable one. Lord Beaverbrook and Lord Rothermere were the two most powerful press proprietors in Britain in 1936, and their involvement in the management of the abdication's public narrative is the piece of the story that the romantic account has treated most superficially, because the romantic account is organized around the constitutional drama rather than around the commercial and political negotiations that produced the press silence that sustained the constitutional drama's management. Baldwin met with the proprietors in October 1936 and secured from them the voluntary suppression agreement that kept the story out of the British press for the weeks of the crisis's most intense domestic management, and the meeting is documented in the accounts of the people who were informed of its substance. But what the meeting's documentation has never fully established is the specific terms of the exchange that produced the voluntary suppression. The voluntary suppression was not free. Press proprietors of Beaverbrook's and Rothermere's standing did not suppress major stories out of civic virtue and national feeling, although civic virtue and national feeling were the reasons they gave publicly for the suppression when it was subsequently acknowledged. They suppressed them when the suppression served their interests, and the interests that the abdication suppression served were interests that the proprietors and the government understood without the understanding requiring explicit statement, because the understanding was the understanding of people who had been operating in the same political and commercial ecosystem for long enough to know what the unspoken terms of the arrangement were. The arrangement was the arrangement of people who managed information as a resource and who understood that the specific information they were managing in October 1936 was a resource whose value depended on its controlled release rather than its immediate publication. Beaverbrook's subsequent account of the period, delivered to his biographer A.J.P. Taylor in the years after the war, described his role in the suppression in terms that emphasized his personal affection for Edward and his desire to give the king the time and space to resolve his situation without the additional pressure of public coverage. The account is the account of someone performing the generous friend rather than the calculating proprietor, and it is not dishonest in the sense that the affection for Edward was genuine. What it omits is the commercial dimension of the arrangement, which was the dimension that Taylor's biography was not organized to examine, and that the available record supports in the form of the subsequent treatment that Beaverbrook's publications accorded the Windsors across the exile years, which was treatment substantially warmer than the treatment that Beaverbrook's publications accorded other figures of comparable public profile, and whose warmth was consistent enough across the decades to suggest that the 1936 arrangement had produced a relationship between the proprietor and the exiled duke that extended beyond the single episode of the suppression. Rothermere's Daily Mail, which would become in the post-war decades one of the more consistently sympathetic publications in its treatment of the Windsors' exile, had its own specific relationship to the abdication's management that the subsequent treatment reflects. The Mail's coverage of the Wallis Simpson story in the months before and after the abdication was the coverage of a publication that was managing its obligations to the voluntary suppression agreement while developing the specific framing of the romantic narrative that would serve its commercial interest in the story's subsequent deployment. The romantic framing was the commercially productive framing, because the commercially productive framing of a story involving a beautiful woman and a king is always the romantic one, rather than the surveillance one, and the Mail's investment in the romantic framing was the investment that its commercial model in the celebrity and royal coverage market had always required it to make. The specific information that the government held about Wallis and did not transmit to Parliament is the dimension of the institutional knowledge management that the formal record addresses most directly, because Parliament was the institution that was formally debating the constitutional question, and that was doing so without the specific information about the woman at the center of the question that the government's intelligence operation had produced. MPs who argued against the abdication on the grounds of the marriage's unsuitability were arguing without knowledge of Trundle. MPs who defended Edward's right to marry the woman he chose were defending without knowledge of the financial dependency assessment or the first marriage's specific history. The parliamentary debate was conducted in the information environment that the government's management of the available information had produced, and the information environment was the environment that the government's institutional interest required, rather than the environment that the available information would have created if it had been deployed in the direction of the parliamentary process rather than the direction of the private management. What the palace specifically knew and specifically managed in the private direction is documented in the portions of the archive that Ziegler accessed for the authorized biography, and the documentation establishes a royal household that was receiving information about the woman it was attempting to remove from the prince's life through channels whose existence the household's public management of the situation required not to be acknowledged. The palace knew about the surveillance. The palace was being briefed by the government on the special branch's findings. The palace's management of the crisis and its management of the exile that followed were informed by that briefing in ways that the public account of both the crisis and the exile does not reflect, because the public account was produced by the people doing the managing for the audience that the managing was designed to reach, and the audience was not told about the briefings, or about Trundle, or about Win Spencer's conduct in Canton, or about the financial dependency assessment, because the telling would have required the telling of the thing the management had decided not to tell. The management's decision not to tell produced, across the months of the crisis and the decades of the exile, the specific gap between the public account and the private knowledge that this account has been examining from its first sentence. The gap was maintained across every subsequent management of the story, through the Ziegler authorized biography and the 2003 release of the Special Branch files, and the 2013 release of the MI5 bugging document, with the specific consistency of an institution that had decided in December 1936 what the story of the abdication was going to be, and that maintained that decision through every subsequent archival disclosure, by treating each disclosure as an isolated revelation rather than as a piece of the pattern that the accumulated disclosures assembled. The pattern is the pattern this account has been assembling from the 15 available pieces that the available evidence supports. And the pattern is the pattern of an institution that knew substantially more than it said, and that used what it knew in the direction of the management it required, rather than in the direction of the understanding it prevented. The management was successful in the sense that the romantic account of the abdication and the exile remained the dominant public understanding of both across the century that followed. The success was the success of institutional information management rather than the success of historical accuracy, and the distinction between the two is the distinction that determines whether what the palace knew and hid was the management of a necessary privacy or the production of a necessary fiction, and the evidence assembled across the parts of this account supports the second characterization more completely than it supports the first. Ernest Aldrich Simpson died in November 1958 in London, at the age of 59, of cancer, and his death produced in the press of two countries the specific coverage that the death of a man who was primarily famous for his connection to a more famous person produces. A paragraph in the obituary columns, a reference to his first wife, a note that he had remarried after the divorce, and the observation that he had conducted himself with unusual dignity across the 22 years since the abdication had placed him at the center of the most discussed marital situation in the world. The dignity was the thing the obituaries reached for because it was the most legible quality of his public life, and it was legible because it had been consistent, and it had been consistent because it was the product of a man who had decided at some point during the months of the crisis that the decision about what to say and what not to say was the one decision he still controlled, and who had held to that decision for the rest of his life. He never gave an interview about Wallis. He never sold his account of the marriage to a publisher. He never made himself available to the journalists who attempted to reach him across the 2 decades between the abdication and his death, and the attempts were regular and were refused with the politeness of someone who understood the refusal was permanent rather than provisional. He remarried in 1937, the year of Wallis's wedding to Edward, and the woman he married was Mary Kirk, who had been one of Wallis's closest friends, the woman who had introduced the Simpsons to each other in the specific way that social worlds produce the connections that subsequently determine the characters of everyone connected. The marriage to Mary was the marriage of a man who was rebuilding what had been dismantled, and the rebuilding was accomplished with the same quality of steady, unglamorous competence that had organized the original construction, and the product was a marriage that was, by the accounts of people who knew the Simpsons in the years following, genuinely happy, in the specific way that happiness achieved in the aftermath of an experience that could have destroyed the person who experienced it is genuinely different from the happiness of someone who has never been tested in that direction. Mary Kirk had her own history in the situation, a history that the romantic account of the abdication has consistently treated as peripheral because its inclusion requires the examination of a dimension of Wallis's character that the romantic account cannot easily accommodate. Mary had been the friend through whom Ernest and Wallis had met, and she had been present in their social circle across the years of the marriage, and she had been, across the years when Wallis's attention was moving from Ernest toward Edward, conducting a relationship of her own with Ernest that was the specific relationship of two people discovering, in the dissolution of the marriage they were both adjacent to, the specific clarity about each other that the marriage's existence had prevented them from acting on. Ernest's biographers, in the limited literature that his own reticence about his experience produced, have described the development of his relationship with Mary in terms that are honest about its overlap with the final years of his marriage to Wallis, while being honest also about its genuineness, which is to say that what Ernest and Mary were developing across the years when Wallis was developing her relationship with the Prince of Wales was not the cynical opportunism of two people exploiting a situation, but the genuine feeling of two people discovering each other in the specific context of a shared social world that was being reconfigured by a third party's choices. Wallis's response to the Ernest-Mary development was the response of someone who had made the specific error, common to people who are leaving relationships for other reasons, of assuming that the relationship being left would remain available in the form it had occupied while she was in it. The relationship did not remain available. Ernest moved on, with Mary, and Wallis's response to the moving on was the response that the biographers document with the specific detail of people who had watched a woman who was publicly triumphant, processing a private complication that the public triumph required not to be noticed. She was not gracious about Mary. The specific quality of her ingratitude towards someone who had been her closest friend and who was now marrying her former husband was the quality that the people who observed it found most revealing about the private account behind the public performance of the great love story. Because a woman who had chosen the Prince of Wales over Ernest, and who found herself troubled by Ernest's happiness with someone else, was a woman whose private account of the choice was more complicated than the public account required it to be. Ernest's silence was the silence that Wallis's subsequent life was organized around not having to confront, because the confrontation would have required the acknowledgement that the person she had left had found the thing she had been moving toward when she left him, and that the thing she had found instead was the thing that she was required to perform as superior. The silence made the confrontation unnecessary. He did not speak. She did not have to answer. The space between them was the space of the managed absence, maintained across 22 years by his reticence and by the geographic distance that the exile and the London life produced, and the maintenance was the management of a specific grief that the public performance of the Wallis-Edward marriage required to be filed in the category of the past, rather than acknowledged as the present it continued to be. Freda Dudley Ward's subsequent life, assembled from the accounts of people who knew her in the decades following the switchboard call that ended 16 years of her primary emotional life in a single afternoon, is the life of a woman who had decided that the experience did not define her and who proved the decision through the specific quality of the subsequent decades. She remarried in 1937, the Marquis de Casa Mori, and the marriage lasted a decade and ended in divorce, and she subsequently built a career in fashion, working for Norman Hartnell and establishing herself as a professional person of genuine competence in an industry that has always been organized around exactly the qualities that managing the Prince of Wales's emotional requirements across 16 years had developed: the precise understanding of what a specific person needs and the ability to provide it in the form that serves both the provider and the recipient. She ran her own dress business in London across the 1950s and 1960s and was, by the accounts of the people who knew her professionally in those years, extremely good at it. She never spoke publicly about Edward in terms that exposed what the 16 years had actually contained, and the not speaking was the specific dignity that the public accounts of her noted and that her children subsequently confirmed was the product of a deliberate decision rather than the absence of material to deploy. She had material. The letters alone were material of the specific commercial and historical value that the publishing industry of the post-war decades would have paid substantially for, and she neither published them nor sold them, and the decision not to do either was maintained across the decades until her death in 1983, which placed her among the very small category of people whose connection to the abdication and to Edward had produced a first-hand private account of the man behind the public performance, and who had chosen to keep the account private. The institution never acknowledged her. No letter from the palace arrived, marking the end of the 16 years, or expressing the institution's recognition of the specific quality of the management she had provided across those years. No member of the royal family contacted her in public form at any point between the switchboard call and her death. The institution that had been the environment of the relationship she maintained for 16 years treated the relationship's end with the same thoroughness that it treated the relationship's existence. The thoroughness of not noticing, maintained through the systematic application of the royal household's most effective management technique, which was the technique of the managed absence, the systematic non-acknowledgement of the thing whose acknowledgement would require the acknowledgement of everything that the acknowledgement would produce. Thelma Furness's account of what had happened to her is the most publicly available of the three women's accounts, because Thelma, unlike Freda and unlike Ernest, chose to publish. Her memoir Double Exposure, written with her twin sister Gloria Vanderbilt and published in 1958, contained the account of the bread incident that Part 5 of this account examined, and contained the specific quality of a woman who had decided that her account of the events was her own to deploy, rather than the institution's to suppress, and who deployed it with the combination of candor and restraint that someone in her position achieves when they understand that what they are describing will be measured against the romantic legend of the relationship that replaced them. She was candid about what she had observed at the Fort Belvedere dinner table. She was restrained about what the observation had cost her. The restraint was not the reticence of Freda or the silence of Ernest. It was the restraint of someone who understood the commercial and social parameters of what she was publishing, and who had calibrated the disclosure to the parameters rather than to the full account. The full account, across all three women, would have been the account of a man whose relationship to women was the relationship of someone who required from them a specific service, and who terminated each relationship with the specific efficiency of someone for whom the service's termination was the relationship's termination, without the specific acknowledgement that the service's provision across months or years had produced an obligation of any kind. Freda provided the service across 16 years. Thelma provided it for 4. Ernest provided a different kind of service for 8. The service of the husband, whose position in Wallis's life had given the prince's relationship with her its specific social architecture, and whose compliance with the divorce arrangement had made the abdication's formal mechanism available. All three received, at the end of their service, the specific form of institutional non-acknowledgement that the palace applied to inconvenient relationships, with the consistency of an institution that had decided the relationships were private matters rather than institutional ones, and that the decision relieved it of the obligation of acknowledgement. The institution's treatment of the three women is the evidence of what the institution actually valued about the relationships, which was what the relationships provided to the institution's most inconvenient member, rather than what they cost the people providing it. Freda provided Edward with the emotional management that kept him functional across the years when the institution needed him to be functional. Thelma provided the transition between Freda's management and Wallis's. Ernest provided the social architecture that made Wallis's position in London's upper-middle-class society the position from which the prince's attentions could be developed into the attachment that produced the crisis. Each provided something the institution used. None received from the institution anything that acknowledged the using. The institution received, from the crisis that all three had contributed to, in their different ways, the abdication and the new king and the family that the new king produced, and the reign that the family produced. And the reign was the most successful in the crown's modern history, and the success was built on the foundation of the crisis, and the crisis was built on the management of the man who the crisis removed. And the management of the man was the labor of the three women who were left, unnamed and unacknowledged, in the specific way that labor whose product is someone else's is unnamed and unacknowledged by the institution that benefits from it. Ernest Simpson died in 1958, having published nothing. Freda Dudley Ward died in 1983, having published nothing. Thelma Furness died in 1970, having published the memoir that was the most she chose to say, which was considerably less than she could have said, and the choosing was the choosing of a woman who understood that the full account was more than the occasion required, and who limited herself to the occasion rather than to the full account, and the limitation was itself a form of dignity, if not the same form as the silence. What all three had in common, across the different forms their subsequent silence or limited disclosure took, was the specific experience of having been the primary emotional environment of the man whose departure from the throne the abdication legend had converted into the story of a love so great it outweighed a kingdom. The love had outweighed the kingdom in the specific sense that the legend required. What it had not outweighed was the 16 years of Freda's letters, and the 4 years of Thelma's management, and the 8 years of Ernest's marriage, and the specific human content of 3 relationships that the legend had filed as preliminary material, as the preface to the real story, as the context for the event, rather than as the events themselves. The events themselves are in the record in the form that the record contains them, and the form is the form of the not speaking, maintained by people who had decided that the speaking was not theirs to do, and who maintained the decision across the decades of the legend's construction, without the legend acknowledging that the decision was being made, or that the decision's maintenance was the specific form of service that the legend most completely depended on and least completely acknowledged. Thank you so much for watching until the end. If you loved this story, check out the other videos on your screen now. I think you'll really enjoy them. And don't forget to subscribe if you haven't already. See you in the next story.